The most decorated military commander in Islamic history spent years trying to destroy Islam before he ever fought for it. A Lutheran duke handed the Protestant Reformation's greatest military alliance to a Catholic emperor, then turned around and saved the very faith he had betrayed. A Christian prince, taken from his family as a child, grew up to lead Muslim armies against his own brother on behalf of the empire that had kidnapped him. A king spent 20 years leading Protestant armies into battle, then converted to Catholicism and became the head of the church his former allies were fighting against. These are not stories about weak men or confused men. They are stories about some of the most capable, determined, and consequential soldiers in history, men who found themselves on the opposite side of the religious line they were born on, for reasons that range from genuine transformation to cold political calculation to circumstances so extreme that no clean moral judgment survives contact with the full facts. 10 soldiers, 10 religions turned against themselves. This is what actually happened. 1. Khalid ibn al-Walid, the man who tried to destroy Islam, then became its greatest sword. The year is 625 CE. The slopes of Mount Uhud, 3 miles north of Medina, are soaked in blood. The Muslim army, which had been winning, is now breaking apart. Soldiers are running. The Prophet Muhammad himself has been wounded, and the man responsible for this reversal is a Quraysh cavalry commander named Khalid ibn al-Walid. Khalid had spotted something. A group of Muslim archers stationed on a small hill had abandoned their post. The Prophet had ordered them to stay there no matter what happened. But when the battle below seemed to be turning in the Muslims' favor, 50 of them came down to join the looting of the Quraysh camp. Khalid saw the gap. He wheeled his cavalry around the back of the mountain, hit the remaining Muslim archers from behind, killed them, and then drove his horsemen into the exposed rear of the Muslim army. What had been a Quraysh retreat became a Muslim rout. Around 70 Muslims died that day, including Hamza ibn Abd al-Muttalib, the Prophet's uncle and one of the most respected men in the early Muslim community. The Prophet himself took a blow to his face that knocked out one of his teeth and split his lip. He had to be carried off the battlefield. Khalid did not do this by accident or by luck. He was the most gifted cavalry commander in Arabia. He had grown up in the Banu Makhzum clan of the Quraysh, one of the most powerful families in Mecca. His father, Al-Walid ibn al-Mughira, was a prominent Meccan leader. Khalid was trained from boyhood in horsemanship and warfare, and by the time the conflict between Muhammad and the Quraysh began, he was already recognized as the finest military mind among them. The Quraysh did not win much against the Muslims, but at Uhud, largely because of Khalid, they did. This was not his only engagement against the Muslims. He had also fought at the Battle of the Trench in 627 CE, where the Quraysh and their allies besieged Medina. He led a cavalry detachment that attempted to cross the defensive trench the Muslims had dug around the city, probing for weaknesses. The attempt failed, but the fact that he was the one testing those defenses tells you everything about his role. When the Quraysh needed their most dangerous soldier, they sent Khalid. He also personally commanded the cavalry unit that intercepted the Muslims near Hudaybiyah in 628 CE, when the Prophet was leading his followers toward Mecca to perform the pilgrimage. Khalid rode out with 200 horsemen to block them. The confrontation did not turn into a full battle, and the Treaty of Hudaybiyah was eventually signed. But Khalid was there, on the field, positioned to fight. By any measure of the time, Khalid ibn al-Walid was Islam's most effective military enemy. He had inflicted more damage on the Muslim community than almost any other single person alive. Then, he converted. The process that led him there was slow. In his own account, preserved in Arab historical sources, including the biography compiled by Ibn Hisham and referenced in Arab news, Khalid began to reflect on the pattern of events around him. He had fought the Muslims repeatedly. He was skilled and brave, and yet every time he looked at the larger picture, something felt wrong. Muhammad kept winning, not always on individual battlefields, but in the broader sweep of things. The movement kept growing. The people who followed him kept coming back. Khalid began to wonder whether he was on the right side of history, and more than that, whether he was on the right side of something larger than history. His brother Walid had already converted to Islam and was living in Medina. During the compensatory pilgrimage of 629 CE, when Muhammad and his followers were allowed into Mecca for 3 days under the terms of Hudaybiyah, Khalid left the city rather than watch. He went into the mountains and stayed there until they were gone. When he came back, he found a letter from his brother waiting for him. Walid wrote that the Prophet had asked about him. The Prophet had said, in Walid's words, "A man like Khalid should not be ignorant of Islam," that his intelligence and ability were needed. Something shifted. Khalid made his decision. He traveled to Medina with two other prominent men who were also converting, including Amr ibn al-As, who would later become a major commander himself. When he arrived and stood before the Prophet, Muhammad told him that he had expected this moment. He gave Khalid the formal greeting of a new Muslim and appointed him as a military commander on the spot. What happened next is one of the most dramatic reversals in military history. Within months of his conversion, Khalid was commanding Muslim forces at the Battle of Mu'tah in 629 CE, on the northern borders of the Arabian Peninsula. The Muslim army of around 3,000 men faced a Byzantine force that historical accounts describe as vastly larger. 3 successive Muslim commanders were killed in the fighting. The banner was about to fall. A soldier named Thabit ibn al-Arqam picked it up and handed it to Khalid, telling him he was the best military mind present. Khalid took command. He could not win the battle outright, but he did something arguably more valuable. He reorganized the Muslim formation under fire, repositioned forces in a way that made the Byzantine army think reinforcements had arrived, and executed a fighting withdrawal that got the Muslim army out without being destroyed. He broke 9 swords during that engagement, according to Sahih al-Bukhari. The Prophet, receiving word of events through revelation while in Medina, told his companions that Khalid had taken the banner and that Allah had brought victory through him. He gave Khalid the title Saif Allah, Sword of Allah. After the conquest of Mecca in 630 CE, Khalid fought in the Battle of Hunain against the Hawazin tribe, one of the last major military confrontations of the Prophet's lifetime. Then came the Ridda Wars, following Muhammad's death in 632 CE, when several Arabian tribes withdrew their allegiance to the Muslim state and some followed false prophets. Khalid commanded the campaigns to bring them back. He defeated Tulayha, who had claimed prophethood. He fought the forces of Musaylima, another false prophet, in the Battle of Yamama in 632 CE, one of the bloodiest engagements of the early Muslim period. Then the Caliphate sent him north. The Caliph Abu Bakr dispatched Khalid to Iraq in 633 CE. He launched a series of campaigns against the Sassanid Persian Empire, winning engagements at Walaja and Ulais, and taking the city of Al-Hira. Then, in a move that military historians still study, he led his army on a rapid crossing of the Syrian desert to reinforce Muslim forces in Syria, covering a distance in days that most armies of the period would have taken weeks to cross. This march alone has been cited by historians as evidence of exceptional operational planning. In Syria, he took command of the Muslim forces facing the Byzantine Empire. He won at Ajnadain in 634 CE. He took Damascus, which surrendered on September 4th, 635 CE after a siege. Then came the Battle of Yarmouk in August 636 CE, fought along the ravines of the Yarmouk River Valley near what is now the border of modern Syria, Jordan, and Israel. The Byzantine force was large and included Armenian, Christian Arab, and other auxiliary troops. Khalid coordinated a multi-day battle across difficult terrain. When many of the Byzantine auxiliaries deserted, Khalid attacked. The sources recorded approximately 50,000 Byzantine troops killed. Khalid's Wikipedia entry, drawn from multiple academic sources, describes it as one of the most consequential battles in history. It ended Byzantine control of Syria and opened the Levant to Muslim rule. The man who had tried to destroy Islam at Uhud had now, within 7 years of his conversion, dismantled Byzantine power in the entire region. His career was not without controversy. The Caliph Umar dismissed him from high command after the siege of Damascus, for reasons that ancient sources do not make entirely clear. Some accounts suggest Umar was concerned about the cult of personality forming around Khalid, that soldiers were attributing victories to Khalid rather than to Allah. Khalid remained in the army as a subordinate commander under Abu Ubaidah ibn al-Jarrah, still fighting, still winning, but no longer in supreme command. There is also the documented killing of Malik ibn Nuwayra during the Ridda Wars, which generated serious controversy even among early Muslims. Khalid had Malik executed after an argument about whether he had truly apostated from Islam, and then took Malik's widow as a wife that same night. The Caliph Omar demanded Khalid be punished. Abu Bakr declined, calling it a mistake rather than a crime. The incident reveals that Khalid was not a saintly figure. He was a violent man in a violent age, and the ruthlessness that made him effective as a general also made him capable of serious moral failures. He died in 642 CE, either in Medina or in Homs, during the Caliphate of Umar. The exact location is disputed, but the manner of his death is agreed upon by the sources. He died in bed. He was not killed in battle, and this is documented as having devastated him. He reportedly said before his death that he had fought in battle after battle, and there was no spot on his body without a wound from a sword or an arrow. Yet there he was, dying like a camel dies, in bed. He said that the cowards would never have rest. His mausoleum is in Homs, Syria. It was built and rebuilt across the centuries, altered by Saladin, added to by the Mamluks, and rebuilt by the Ottomans in 1908. It still stands. The arithmetic of his life is staggering. At Uhud, in 625 CE, he inflicted one of the worst defeats the early Muslim community ever suffered. He wounded the Prophet, killed the Prophet's uncle, and broke the Muslim army. 14 years later, he had fought over 100 engagements under the banner of Islam without a single defeat, according to the historical record. He had conquered Al-Hira, crossed the Syrian desert in a forced march, taken Damascus, and shattered Byzantine power at Yarmouk. He had given Islam military victories that shaped the political map of the Middle East for the next 14 centuries. The same mind, the same tactical genius, the same ferocity on a horse, pointed in the opposite direction. What makes his story unlike almost any other in military history is that his skills did not change. His ability to read terrain, to identify the weakness in an enemy formation, to move cavalry at exactly the right moment, to hold a line under pressure, to inspire men to fight beyond what they thought possible. All of that was exactly the same before and after his conversion. He did not become a different kind of soldier. He became a soldier fighting for a different cause. And the cause he had spent years trying to destroy became, through him, practically unstoppable. __quote _0 __. The next soldier on this list also changed sides in a religious war, but for completely different reasons. Where Khalid converted out of genuine conviction after years of reflection, the man in the next section betrayed his own Protestant faith, not for belief, but for land, title, and the most ruthless political calculation of the 16th century, and the consequences shook the entire Protestant Reformation to its foundations. 2. Maurice, Duke of Saxony, the Lutheran who fought to crush Lutheranism. Maurice of Saxony was 25 years old when he made the decision that would brand him a traitor to every Protestant in Europe. He was a Lutheran. He had been raised Lutheran. He lived in a Lutheran duchy, attended Lutheran services, and governed Lutheran subjects. The Schmalkaldic League, the military alliance of Protestant princes and cities formed in 1531 to defend Lutheranism against the Catholic Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, was led by two men Maurice knew personally. One of them, John Frederick I of Saxony, was his cousin. The other, Philip of Hesse, was his father-in-law. In 1546, Maurice allied with Charles V and helped destroy them both. To understand what Maurice did, you need to understand what the Schmalkaldic League was and what it represented. After Martin Luther posted his theses in 1517, and the Reformation began tearing through the Holy Roman Empire, Lutheran princes faced a fundamental problem. The emperor was Catholic. The Pope was Catholic. The official law of the empire, the Edict of Worms issued in 1521, had banned Lutheranism entirely and put Luther himself under imperial ban. Lutheran rulers who refused to comply were technically in rebellion against the emperor. They needed a collective defense arrangement, because individually, they could be picked off one by one. The League formed at Schmalkalden in Thuringia in December 1530 and was ratified in February 1531. Its founding members included John Frederick I, Elector of Saxony, and Philip I, Landgrave of Hesse. Its stated purpose was mutual military defense of the Lutheran faith. If the emperor moved against any member, the others would treat it as an attack on all of them. It was the Protestant world's insurance policy. Maurice was not a member. He had refused to join, and his refusal had a specific reason that everyone at the time understood. The Saxony electorship, the most prestigious title in the German Protestant world, was held by John Frederick I, Maurice's cousin from the rival Ernestine branch of the Wettin dynasty. Maurice was from the Albertine branch. The two branches had been in tension for decades over territory, tax revenue, and prestige. In 1542, during what was called the Wurzener feud, the two cousins had come close to open war over a disputed territory. Martin Luther himself intervened to prevent it. Philip of Hesse also helped mediate. The fact that Maurice's own father-in-law had to step in to stop Maurice from going to war with the Schmalkaldic League's leader tells you something about where Maurice's loyalties actually sat. Charles V had been watching all of this. He was not ready to fight the League for most of the 1540s because he kept getting pulled into wars with France and the Ottoman Empire. But by 1544, after signing the Treaty of Crespi with France, he had his hands free. He began building alliances. He reached out to Maurice privately and made him an offer. If Maurice helped the emperor defeat John Frederick I, Maurice would receive the Saxon electorship, the title and lands his cousin currently held. Maurice would become the most powerful Protestant prince in Germany. Maurice said yes. The decision was not impulsive. He took time. He negotiated terms. He understood exactly what he was doing. Britannica's biography of Maurice confirms that in 1545, he was dissuaded from supporting the Schmalkaldic League by the imperial promise of the Saxon electorship. The Wikipedia article on the Schmalkaldic War documents that in 1544, Charles forged alliances with Lutheran princes, foremost among them Maurice of Saxony. Maurice knew that the emperor was preparing for war. He knew that war would be fought against the league his father-in-law led. He signed up for the emperor's side anyway. The Schmalkaldic War began in July 1546. John Frederick and Philip of Hesse were placed under imperial ban on July 20th, 1546, on the pretext that they had deposed a Catholic duke several years earlier. This was the legal cover for the military campaign. Maurice's role was to open a second front. While John Frederick's armies were deployed in southern Germany, fighting imperial forces there, Maurice invaded John Frederick's own territory in Ernestine Saxony from the north, with assistance from Ferdinand I, the emperor's brother. This forced John Frederick to abandon the southern campaign and rush back to defend his homeland. The move worked exactly as designed. John Frederick raced north, drove Maurice back, and for a time even invaded Albertine Saxony, Maurice's own territory. The onset of winter made the fighting inconclusive, but in spring 1547, Charles V marched north from Bohemia with the main imperial army, including Spanish troops. Maurice's forces rejoined the emperor. John Frederick was now caught between them. The decisive engagement came at the Battle of Mühlberg on April 24, 1547, on the banks of the Elbe River in the Electorate of Saxony. Contemporary chronicles record that the imperial forces crossed the Elbe and caught John Frederick's army largely unprepared. The Protestant army was routed. John Frederick himself was captured during the battle. He was wounded, brought before the emperor, and sentenced to death. The sentence was not carried out. To save his life, John Frederick signed the capitulation of Wittenberg on May 19, 1547. He surrendered the electoral dignity of Saxony and ceded substantial territories to his cousin Maurice. Philip of Hesse, Maurice's father-in-law, surrendered shortly afterward and was also imprisoned by the emperor. The Schmalkaldic League was dissolved. Its two leaders were now prisoners of the Catholic emperor they had spent 16 years organizing to resist. And Maurice of Saxony, the Lutheran who had delivered them there, was raised to the dignity of Elector of Saxony in a ceremony in the field camp after the battle on June 4, 1547. He had gotten exactly what he wanted. And in Protestant Europe, his name became synonymous with treachery. The contemporary reaction was fierce. Protestant writers and preachers condemned him as Judas. His former allies in the League regarded him as someone who had not merely chosen the wrong side in a political dispute, but had stabbed the Protestant cause in the back at the moment it most needed solidarity. The Tudor Times account notes that his cousin John Frederick, whom he had helped imprison, came from a family that had been among Luther's earliest and most committed protectors. It was John Frederick's father, Frederick the Wise, who had hidden Luther at Wartburg Castle after the Diet of Worms. The Ernestine branch of the Wettin dynasty had essentially been the guardian of the Reformation. Maurice had just helped crush them. The religious dimension was not lost on anyone. The emperor's victory at Mühlberg led directly to the Augsburg Interim of 1548, an imperial decree ordering Protestants throughout the empire to readopt Catholic practices, including the seven sacraments, transubstantiation, and papal authority, while making minor concessions like allowing married clergy to remain married. This was the religious consequence of Maurice's military betrayal. The Protestant world that the Schmalkaldic League had been built to protect was now being forced back toward Catholicism by imperial decree. And it had happened in large part because a Lutheran duke opened the second front that made it possible. Maurice's own duchy was not immune. He worked with the theologian Philip Melanchthon to develop the Leipzig Interim of late 1548, a compromise document that tried to preserve core Lutheran theology, specifically justification by grace through faith, while conceding on ceremonial matters. Hardline Lutherans, who became known as Gnesio-Lutherans or genuine Lutherans, rejected both the Augsburg Interim and the Leipzig Interim. They saw any compromise as capitulation. Maurice found himself attacked from both sides. The emperor thought he had not done enough to restore Catholicism. The Lutherans thought he had done too much to accommodate it. The position he had put himself in was impossible to hold. He had betrayed the Protestants to win the electorship, and now the emperor was using that victory to crush Protestant practice across the empire. Maurice began to calculate again. By 1552, he had made a new decision. He used the commission the emperor had given him to subdue the Protestant city of Magdeburg, which had refused to accept the Augsburg Interim and had become a center of resistance, to instead raise an army while appearing to be loyal. He forged secret alliances with France and with Protestant princes who had been waiting for an opportunity. Then, in April 1552, Maurice attacked Charles V's forces at Augsburg. The emperor, who had not seen it coming, was forced to flee through the Alps. He never fully recovered from the shock of being outmaneuvered by the man he had trusted. The Wikipedia article on Maurice records that the Augsburg Interim source notes his reasoning directly. It was more expedient for him to be viewed as a champion of Lutheranism than as a traitor. The calculation was as cold in 1552 as it had been in 1546. Maurice was not experiencing a religious awakening. He was reading the political situation and adjusting his position accordingly. The result of his 1552 campaign was the Peace of Passau, signed in August 1552, which provisionally guaranteed Lutheran religious practice and secured the release of both Philip of Hesse and John Frederick I from imperial captivity. The Schmalkaldic League's leaders, the men Maurice had helped imprison 5 years earlier, walked out of their cells because Maurice had forced the emperor to let them go. This situation, a man releasing the prisoners he had helped capture, through a war against the captor he had helped win, is almost without parallel in the history of religious conflict. 3 years after Passau, the Peace of Augsburg in 1555 made the provisional guarantee permanent, establishing the principle of cuius regio, eius religio, meaning that each ruler could choose the religion of his territory between Catholicism and Lutheranism. This settlement, which gave Lutheranism legal recognition within the Holy Roman Empire for the first time, was built on the foundation of the 1552 campaign that Maurice had launched. Maurice did not live to see it fully implemented. At the Battle of Sievershausen on July 9, 1553, he was shot in the stomach, reportedly from behind, while fighting against Albert Alcibiades of Brandenburg-Kulmbach, a former ally who had rejected the Peace of Passau and continued raiding. Maurice won the battle. He died 2 days later in his field camp, on July 11, 1553, at the age of 32. He was buried in Freiburg Cathedral in Saxony, where his tomb still stands. The historical assessment of Maurice has never been simple. Protestant writers in his own century mostly remembered him as a traitor. Later historians gave more weight to his 1552 reversal and argued that the Peace of Augsburg, which legally secured Lutheranism within the empire, might not have happened without him. The Wikipedia article on Maurice notes that when he returned to Saxony after the Peace of Passau, he was no longer seen as a traitor, and both Protestants and Catholics rendered him equal respect. Whether that redemption is deserved depends on how you weigh the original betrayal against the later reversal. What is not in dispute is the sequence of events. A Lutheran prince joined a Catholic emperor to militarily destroy the Lutheran Defensive Alliance, helped imprison its leaders, received his reward, watched the emperor use the victory to try to reimpose Catholicism, change sides again, force the emperor to flee, and help secure legal protection for the faith he had earlier helped crush. He did all of this by the age of 32. Quote 1. The soldiers in the next story faced a different kind of impossible choice. Where Maurice betrayed Lutheranism for ambition and then pulled back when he saw where that betrayal was leading, Radu the Handsome went further. He did not just fight against his faith for land or title. He converted to the religion of his captors as a child, spent his entire adult life serving their empire, and then led their armies against his own Christian brother in a campaign that would define the future of the Balkans. 3. Radu the Handsome, the Christian prince who fought for Islam against his own brother and faith. Radu was 7 years old when his father handed him to the Ottoman Sultan. In 1442, Vlad II Dracul, the ruler of Wallachia, had a problem. He had been caught between two powers, the Catholic Kingdom of Hungary to the north and the Ottoman Empire to the south, and he had made promises to both that he could not keep simultaneously. Sultan Murad II summoned him to prove his loyalty. Vlad II traveled to the Ottoman court with two of his sons, Vlad, who was around 11, and Radu, who was around 7. The Sultan released Vlad II but kept the boys. They would remain as hostages to guarantee their father's behavior. If Vlad II betrayed the Ottomans again, his sons would pay for it. This arrangement, called hostage diplomacy, was standard practice in the medieval world. It was brutal, but common. What was not common was what happened to one of those two boys over the years that followed. Vlad, the older brother, responded to captivity with defiance. He maintained his Orthodox Christian identity, resented his captors, and when he eventually left Ottoman custody, he did so as an enemy of the empire that had held him. The man the world would come to know as Vlad the Impaler spent most of his adult life fighting the Ottomans with a ferocity that shocked even his own century. Radu went the other way entirely. The younger brother adapted. He learned Turkish. He studied the Quran. He absorbed Ottoman culture, Ottoman customs, and Ottoman ways of thinking about power and war. He became close to Mehmed, the Sultan's son and heir, who was close to his own age. By the time Radu was a young man, he was not merely a hostage being tolerated at the Ottoman court. He was a trusted figure within it. He converted to Islam, though some of his later letters refer to himself as Christ-loving, which has led historians to debate how complete or sincere that conversion was. What is not disputed is his military and political alignment. Whatever Radu believed privately, he served the Ottoman state, fought for the Ottoman state, and eventually governed on behalf of the Ottoman state. The first major test of that alignment came in 1453. Mehmed II became Sultan in 1451 and immediately began preparing for the campaign that would define his reign. Constantinople, the capital of the Byzantine Empire, had been a Christian city for over 1,000 years. It was the seat of the Orthodox Church, the repository of Roman imperial tradition, and the greatest urban center in the Christian world. Mehmed wanted it. He spent years building up his forces, developing new siege weapons, including massive cannons designed specifically to breach the city's famous walls, and assembling an army that contemporaries estimated at over 100,000 men. Radu was part of that force. The Wikipedia article on Radu the Handsome documents that he participated in the siege of Constantinople. He was there on 29th May, 1453, when the walls finally broke, when Mehmed's forces poured into the city, when the last Byzantine emperor, Constantine XI, died fighting on the walls, and when the 1,000-year Christian capital of the Eastern world fell to an Islamic empire. Radu did not watch this from a distance. He was inside the Ottoman military structure, under the command of the man he had grown up alongside, fighting against the defenders of a Christian city. After the fall of Constantinople, Radu lived at the newly claimed Ottoman capital. He was a fixture of Mehmed's court, trusted and valued. The Serbian Janissary Konstantin Mihailović, who served in the Ottoman military during this period, later documented that Radu held a command position within the Janissary Corps, the elite infantry force of the Ottoman army. His path from Christian hostage child to Janissary commander had taken roughly a decade. The collision course with his brother was set in 1461. Vlad III had been ruling Wallachia since 1456, and had spent those years doing two things simultaneously: consolidating power inside the principality with extreme violence against his enemies, and refusing to cooperate with the Ottomans. He had stopped paying the annual tribute of 10,000 gold ducats that Wallachia owed as a vassal state. He had also refused to provide the annual levy of young boys for the devshirme system, the Ottoman practice of conscripting Christian boys to be trained as soldiers or administrators. When Mehmed sent envoys to press the matter, Vlad had them killed, reportedly by nailing their turbans to their heads because they had refused to remove them in his presence. This was not something Mehmed could ignore. In 1462, he assembled a massive army and sailed for Wallachia. Radu came with him. According to the Wikipedia article on Radu, he was at the head of 4,000 horsemen drawn from the Janissary forces in the campaign against his brother. A Christian-born prince, commanding Muslim elite cavalry, invading the Christian principality his family had ruled for generations, to depose his own brother. What Vlad did in response has become legendary. He knew he could not fight Mehmed's army in open battle. His forces were vastly outnumbered, so he used the terrain, the disease environment, the summer heat, and psychological warfare. He poisoned wells. He drove infected people and animals into the path of the Ottoman advance. He burned crops and settlements so the invaders would find nothing to eat or use. He launched a famous night attack on June 16th and 17th, 1462, infiltrating the Ottoman camp near the Wallachian capital of Targoviste in an attempt to kill Mehmed directly. The attack missed the Sultan's tent and hit those of his viziers instead. It failed in its primary objective, but caused chaos and casualties. When Mehmed's army finally reached Targoviste, they found the city empty, and outside it they found what the sources describe as a forest of stakes. Vlad had impaled the bodies of captured Ottoman soldiers, around 20,000 of them according to multiple historical accounts, on wooden stakes arranged in a semicircle stretching for miles outside the city. The Greek historian Chalkokondyles wrote that the Sultan was seized with amazement at the sight, and said that a man who had done such things was worth much. Mehmed halted his advance, but he did not withdraw entirely. He left Radu behind with Ottoman forces and returned to Constantinople. The strategy that followed was Radu's. Where Vlad had ruled through terror, Radu offered amnesty. He sent word to the Wallachian boyars, the powerful noble class whose cooperation was essential to holding the principality, that those who submitted to him would keep their lands and titles. He promised to end the forced recruitment of boys for the Janissary Corps. He offered stability after years of Vlad's violent purges. The Wikipedia article on Radu documents that this propaganda campaign was effective, causing increasing defections within Vlad's ranks. The wealthy city of Brasov also shifted its support to Radu, which the All That's Interesting historical account describes as delivering the final blow to Vlad's position. Vlad was left without enough support to continue fighting. He fled to Transylvania to seek help from Matthias Corvinus, the king of Hungary, who had previously been his ally. Instead of receiving help, Vlad was arrested by Corvinus, apparently on the basis of letters, possibly forged, suggesting that Vlad had offered an alliance to the Ottomans. He was imprisoned at Visegrad and held there from 1463 to 1475. The man who had built a forest of impaled bodies to stop an Ottoman invasion ended up in a Hungarian dungeon, put there partly through the success of his own brother's political campaign. Radu ruled Wallachia from 1462 to 1475, with some interruptions. His rule was marked by alignment with the Ottoman Empire, commercial relationships with Saxon merchants in Transylvania, and the relative domestic calm that came from not conducting mass executions of the nobility. He was a competent administrator by the standards of his time and place. He was not Vlad. That was, for many Wallachians, the point. His most persistent military opponent during this period was not his imprisoned brother, but Stephen III of Moldavia, also known as Stephen the Great, who launched multiple incursions into Wallachian territory. The most significant of these was the Battle of Sochi in 1471, fought over control of the Chilia fortress on the Danube. The La Brújula Verde historical account notes that Stephen was a devout Christian who could not tolerate Radu's apostasy and his submission of Wallachia to Muslim Ottoman authority. The two fought several engagements, with control of territory shifting back and forth. By 1473, for reasons that historians have not fully resolved, the Wallachian boyars elected one of their own as prince, rather than continuing with Radu. He lost the throne and regained it again, before eventually losing it permanently. He died in January 1475, not in battle, but of syphilis, according to historical accounts. He was around 36 or 37 years old. His daughter, Maria Wojcita, later married Stephen the Great of Moldavia, the same man who had fought her father for years over Wallachia. The question of how to assess Radu has never been simple, and it was not simple even in his own lifetime. He called himself Christ-loving in his letters, while commanding Janissary forces for a Muslim sultan. He governed a Christian Orthodox population while serving the Ottoman Empire that had converted him as a child. His contemporary, Stephen the Great of Moldavia, himself a Christian ruler, viewed him as an apostate and an enemy of his faith. Romanian historical memory has generally been much harder on Radu than on Vlad, despite Vlad's extraordinary violence, because Radu chose what many saw as the wrong side of a civilizational conflict. The Grokopedia article on Radu, drawing on academic sources, makes clear that the evidence for his formal conversion to Islam is indirect and tied to later affiliations rather than any documented ceremony or declaration. What is not indirect is his military service. He fought at Constantinople. He commanded Ottoman forces against Wallachia. He governed as an Ottoman vassal. Whatever his private religious beliefs, his public military and political life was entirely in service of the empire that had taken him from his father's court as a 7-year-old boy. There is something worth sitting with in the sequence of events. Two brothers, taken from the same family at the same time, held in the same captivity. One came out as Islam's enemy. One came out as its instrument. The difference was not in their circumstances, which were identical. It was in how they responded to those circumstances over years of living inside an alien court, surrounded by an alien faith, cut off from everything familiar. Vlad hardened. Radu adapted. Both choices shaped the history of Southeastern Europe for generations. Vlad's eventual fate closed the story. He was released from Hungarian captivity in 1475 at the request of Stephen III of Moldavia. He reclaimed the Wallachian throne for a third time in November 1476. He was killed in battle that same month or in December, the exact date is not certain, most likely by Ottoman forces or their allies. His head was sent to Mehmed II in Constantinople, preserved in honey. The empire that the impaler had spent his life fighting had the last word. Radu had died in January 1475. The two brothers died within months of each other, in the same year, at the end of lives that had started in the same place and gone in opposite directions, from the moment they were handed to a sultan as children. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The next case in this series involves a man who also changed religious sides in the middle of a war, but under circumstances that were entirely his own choice, made as an adult at the height of his power, with full understanding of what he was doing and why. Henry IV of France was not taken captive as a child. He was a king, and the religion he abandoned was the one he had spent decades leading into battle. 4. Henry IV of France, the Huguenot king who led Catholic armies against his own Protestant people. Henry of Navarre was born on December 13, 1553 in Pau, in the small mountain kingdom of Navarre, on the border between France and Spain. He was baptized Catholic, as was the custom for children of ruling families in that time and place. But his mother, Jeanne d'Albret, Queen of Navarre, was one of the most committed Protestant rulers in Europe. She declared Calvinism the official religion of Navarre when Henry was a child, had him raised as a Huguenot, and made sure he understood that the Protestant cause was not simply a matter of private belief. It was a political identity, a military cause, and a matter of survival. France in the second half of the 16th century was in the process of tearing itself apart. The wars of religion had begun in 1562, when the Catholic Duke of Guise ordered the massacre of a Huguenot congregation at Vassy, killing around 60 people and wounding many more. Protestant retaliation followed, then Catholic retaliation, then Protestant retaliation again. By the time Henry of Navarre was a teenager, France had already been through multiple cycles of religious civil war, with each side committing atrocities the other used to justify further violence. Estimates of total deaths across the wars of religion range into the millions, making it one of the deadliest internal conflicts in French history. Henry entered this world not as an observer, but as a participant designated by birth. His mother's death in June 1572 made him, at 19, the King of Navarre and the recognized political leader of the Huguenot movement in France. 6 weeks later, he was in Paris for his wedding. The marriage had been arranged by Catherine de' Medici, the queen mother who dominated French royal politics, as a gesture toward reconciliation between the Catholic crown and the Protestant nobility. Henry was to marry Margaret of Valois, the sister of King Charles IX. The wedding took place on August 18, 1572, outside Notre Dame Cathedral, because Henry, as a Protestant, was not permitted to enter for the Catholic Mass. Thousands of Huguenots had traveled to Paris for the occasion, including many of the most prominent Protestant military and political leaders in France. 4 days later, on the night of 23rd to 24th August 1572, the killing began. The Saint. Bartholomew's Day massacre started with the targeted assassination of Gaspard de Coligny, the Admiral of France and the most senior Huguenot military commander. It then spread through Paris as Catholic mobs, with the apparent coordination, or at minimum, the permission of the Royal Council, attacked Protestant households throughout the city. The killing lasted for days in Paris, and then spread to other cities across France over the following weeks. Historical estimates of the total dead across France range from 10,000 to 30,000 people. The Protestant leadership that had gathered in Paris for a royal wedding was slaughtered in a city that had invited them. Henry survived. He survived because he was the King of Navarre, because his royal status gave him a certain protection, and because he agreed, under what the historical sources describe as severe pressure, to convert to Catholicism. He renounced his Protestant faith, accepted Catholic practice, and was kept at the royal court in Paris, essentially as a prisoner, for the next 3.5 years. The Encyclopedia.com entry on Henry IV documents that he escaped from the court in February 1576 and, after recanting his forced conversion, rejoined the Protestant leadership. This sequence matters because it established a pattern. Henry converted under duress in 1572, rejected that conversion when he was free in 1576, and then in 1593 converted again, this time freely and by his own decision. The man converted to Catholicism twice, once because a mob was killing his co-religionists in the streets outside, once because he decided the throne of France was worth it. After his escape in 1576, he consolidated his position as the leader of the Huguenot military cause and spent the following years fighting through 3 more cycles of the wars of religion. He was a capable military commander, personally brave, and able to hold together coalitions that were always threatening to fracture. The Protestant cause in France was not a unified movement. It contained factions, regional interests, and competing ambitions. Henry had to be a politician as much as a soldier. The situation changed permanently in June 1584 when Francis, Duke of Alençon, the youngest brother of King Henry III, died of malaria at 29. This made Henry of Navarre, through the rules of French royal succession under Salic law, the heir presumptive to the French throne. A Protestant was now next in line to be King of France, a country where the vast majority of the population was Catholic and where the Catholic Church's political influence was enormous. The Catholic League, led by Henry, Duke of Guise, refused to accept this. They backed a Catholic alternative claimant and began what became known as the War of the Three Henrys, named for King Henry III, Henry of Navarre, and Henry of Guise, who were the 3 dominant figures in the conflict. The war involved shifting alliances, assassinations, and the increasingly bizarre spectacle of a Catholic king, Henry III, fighting alongside his Protestant heir against the Catholic League that claimed to be defending his own religion. Henry of Guise was assassinated on Henry III's orders in December 1588. Henry III himself was assassinated in August 1589 by a Catholic monk named Jacques Clement. With his death, Henry of Navarre became, by the laws of succession, King Henry IV of France. He was not accepted as such by most of the country. The Catholic League refused to recognize a Protestant king. Much of Catholic France refused to recognize a Protestant king. Spain, under Philip II, refused to recognize a Protestant king and sent troops to support the League's opposition. Henry IV spent the next 4 years fighting to make his legal title into an actual reality, besieging cities, winning battles, and trying to chip away at the coalition opposing him. He won a significant victory at the Battle of Ivry in March 1590, where his cavalry charge broke the League forces. He attempted to besiege Paris in 1590, but was forced to abandon the siege when Spanish forces intervened to resupply the city. The military situation made something clear. Henry IV could win battles. He could not win the war. Paris, the largest and most important city in France, was overwhelmingly Catholic in its population and deeply hostile to a Protestant king. Without Paris, there was no consolidated kingdom, and Paris would not open its gates to a Huguenot. The conversion happened on July 25, 1593. Henry formally renounced Protestantism and converted to Catholicism at the Basilica of Saint Denis. The EBSCO Research Starter's entry on Henry IV of France notes that he never uttered the famous words, "Paris is worth a mass," but that the phrase, which actually originated with Catholics who wanted to impugn the sincerity of his conversion, accurately reflects the pragmatic calculation behind his decision. The encyclopedia.com entry confirms the date and location of the conversion and notes that the advice of his Protestant advisor Maximilien de Bethune and his Catholic mistress Gabrielle d'Estrées both influenced the decision. Pope Clement VIII formally granted him a papal absolution in 1595, confirming his standing as a Catholic. Henry IV was crowned King of France at Chartres Cathedral on February 27, 1594, because Reims, the traditional coronation city, was still held by League forces. Paris opened its gates on March 22, 1594. Between 1593 and 1595, according to the EBSCO account, most of urban France left the Catholic League and accepted Henry IV as king. The war effectively ended, though formal peace with Spain came later through the Treaty of Vervins in 1598. What happened after the conversion is the part that makes Henry IV's story specifically relevant here. He did not simply convert and then govern as a neutral figure above religious faction. He became the Catholic King of France, wielding Catholic institutional authority, and he used that authority in ways that directly affected the Protestant community he had spent decades leading. The Catholic League's remaining military holdouts had to be subdued. Some of this was done through negotiation and generous financial settlements paid to League nobles to buy their submission. Some of it was done through force. As the Catholic king, Henry IV commanded Catholic armies against Catholic League holdouts, which is a different but related irony. The man who had led Protestant armies for 20 years was now directing the military and political machinery of Catholic France. His most significant act toward his former co-religionists was the Edict of Nantes, issued on the 13th of April, 1598. The edict granted Huguenots substantial rights within France, including freedom of worship in designated areas, the right to hold public office, and the maintenance of certain fortified towns as Protestant security guarantees. It is often described as an early example of religious tolerance, and in the context of the 16th century, it was genuinely significant. Protestants in France could, for the first time in decades, exist legally and with some protection. But it is worth being precise about what the edict was and was not. It did not make France a religiously equal society. It reaffirmed Catholicism as the official religion of the kingdom. The Protestant rights it granted were limited, geographically specified, and dependent on royal will rather than constitutional guarantee. And those rights would be revoked entirely by Henry IV's grandson, Louis XIV, in 1685, 75 years after Henry's death, when 200,000 Huguenots fled France rather than convert. Henry IV's personal religious sincerity after 1593 is something historians have debated ever since. Some argue his conversion was purely political, and that he remained privately sympathetic to Protestantism, pointing to the Edict of Nantes as evidence. The EBSCO entry notes that he remained sympathetic to Protestantism and secretly supported the revolt of the Protestant Netherlands against Spain even after his conversion. Others point out that he received papal absolution, was crowned in a Catholic ceremony, governed as a Catholic king, and showed no public sign of Protestant practice for the rest of his life. What is not debatable is the structural reality. For the last 17 years of his life, Henry IV was the head of the Catholic monarchy of France. The Huguenots, the community he had led for 2 decades, were now his subjects rather than his allies. The military machine he commanded was Catholic. The institutional church whose authority he wielded was Catholic. The wars he fought after 1593, including the eventual campaign against Spain, were fought under Catholic royal authority. He was assassinated on 14th May 1610 in Paris. A Catholic fanatic named François Ravaillac stabbed him in his carriage on the Rue de la Ferronnerie, striking twice before being seized. Henry IV died of his wounds that day. He was 56 years old. The irony of his death is worth noting. A man who had survived the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre, who had fought through decades of religious civil war, who had converted religions twice, and who had eventually brought the wars of religion to an end, was killed not by a Protestant enemy, but by a Catholic assassin who believed he was not Catholic enough. Ravaillac had convinced himself that Henry IV was planning to make war against the Pope. The same accusation of religious insufficiency that had followed Henry his entire life, first from Protestants who resented his conversion, then from Catholics who doubted his sincerity, ultimately killed him. He spent his life caught between 2 faiths, trusted fully by neither, and died because a member of the faith he had converted to decided he had not converted far enough. His body was interred at the Basilica of Saint-Denis in Paris, where French royalty had been buried for centuries. His tomb was desecrated during the French Revolution, when revolutionary forces opened the royal vaults. His remains were later reinterred there during the Restoration period. __3___. The next soldiers in this series faced a different kind of impossible situation. Henry IV chose his conversion freely, as a king with options, calculating the political landscape and making a deliberate decision. The men in Section 5 had no real choice at all. They were born into a religion that the state they lived in was actively trying to destroy, and they ended up serving that state in uniform while their families were being sent to death camps. 5. Erhard Milch, the half-Jewish field marshal who built Hitler's Air Force. Erhard Milch was born on March 30, 1892 in Wilhelmshaven, a naval port city on the North Sea coast of Germany. His father, Anton Milch, was a Jewish pharmacist who served in the Imperial German Navy. His mother, Clara, was born Clara Rosenau, a surname that itself suggested possible Jewish ancestry. Under the racial laws that would later define his country, Milch was a Mischling of the first degree, a half-Jew. Under those same laws, he should never have risen above the rank of private in any German military organization. Instead, he became a Generalfeldmarschall, a field marshal, the second most powerful figure in the Luftwaffe, and one of the 6 highest-ranking Air Force officers in Nazi Germany. He got there by building the Air Force that made it all possible. Milch enlisted in the German Army in 1910, straight out of secondary school. He began as an artillery officer in the 1st Heavy Artillery Regiment in Königsberg, East Prussia, and was promoted to lieutenant the following year. When the First World War began in 1914, he served on the Russian front, then transferred to the Imperial Air Service in 1915. He became an aerial observer and then a pilot, and by the closing stages of the war, he was commanding a fighter wing, Jagdgruppe 6, as a captain. The German Army awarded him the Iron Cross First Class for his service. He left the military in 1920, when Germany was required under the Treaty of Versailles to drastically reduce its armed forces. What followed was a civilian career in aviation that would matter enormously a decade later. He formed a small airline, Lloyd Ostflug, based in Danzig, flying passengers to the Baltic states. He then moved to Junkers Luftverkehr, eventually becoming a managing director. When Junkers merged with other regional German airlines, Milch emerged as one of 3 managing directors of the new entity, Deutsche Lufthansa, in 1926, which later became the national German airline, Lufthansa. He ran it until 1933. During those years, he built relationships, organizational systems, and an intimate understanding of how aviation infrastructure worked at scale. He joined the Nazi Party on April 1, 1929, membership number 123,885. The Wikipedia article on Milch notes that his membership was not officially acknowledged until March 1933, because Hitler deemed it desirable to keep the fact hidden for political reasons. The reasons are not entirely clear from the historical record, but the practical effect was that Milch had been a committed Nazi for years before it was publicly known. When Hitler became chancellor in January 1933, and Hermann Göring was tasked with building a German air force in secret because the Treaty of Versailles forbade Germany from having one, Göring turned to Milch. On May 5, 1933, Milch became state secretary of the newly formed Reich Ministry of Aviation, answering directly to Göring. He was given responsibility for armament production and the organizational construction of what would become the Luftwaffe, the air force that Germany used to blitz Poland, the Netherlands, Belgium, and France, and that fought the Battle of Britain, was built substantially by a man whose father was Jewish. The problem with his ancestry surfaced in 1935, as anti-Semitic legislation tightened and the Nuremberg laws came into effect that September, classifying anyone with a Jewish parent as a Mischling of the first degree. Questions began circulating about Milch's father. The Gestapo opened an investigation. The investigation threatened to end his career and potentially his freedom. Göring intervened. The Wikipedia article on Milch documents exactly what happened. Göring produced an affidavit signed by Milch's mother stating that her husband Anton was not actually the biological father of her children. She claimed instead that the father was her uncle, Karl Brauer, who was deceased and could not contradict the statement. The affidavit made Milch the product of incest rather than the son of a Jewish man. Under Nazi racial logic, incest was shameful, but not disqualifying. Jewish ancestry was. The legal paternity was never formally changed, but Milch was issued a German blood certificate that effectively reclassified him as racially acceptable. This produced what became one of the most quoted statements of the entire Nazi period. Göring said, in German, "Wer Jude ist, bestimme ich." I decide who is a Jew in the Air Force. Hitler personally signed off on the arrangement. The Führer had the legal authority under Article 7 of the supplementary Nuremberg decrees to exempt individuals from racial classification, a process historians have called Aryanization. Brian Mark Rigg, whose 2002 book, Hitler's Jewish Soldiers, documented this entire category of Wehrmacht personnel in detail after years of archival research and interviews, confirmed that Hitler personally exempted several high-ranking officers of Jewish descent by signing official German blood declarations. Milch was the most senior of them. With the ancestry problem officially resolved through documented fraud, Milch continued building the Luftwaffe. He commanded Luftflotte 5 during Operation Weserübung, the invasion of Norway in April 1940. The Norwegian campaign was a success. Then came France. When the French campaign ended in German victory in June 1940, Hitler held a ceremony on July 19, 1940, at which he promoted 12 generals to the rank of Generalfeldmarschall simultaneously. Milch was among them. He also received the title Air Inspector General. Following the suicide of Ernst Udet, the Luftwaffe's research and development chief, in November 1941, Milch took over as General Luftzeugmeister, the officer in charge of all Luftwaffe aircraft production, armament, and supply. This made him responsible for one of the most important industrial operations in the entire German war economy. He joined the Central Planning Board in April 1942, alongside Albert Speer, the Reich Minister of Armaments, in an effort to coordinate German industrial war production across all sectors. His performance in this role revealed both his genuine organizational ability and his willingness to use methods that would later be judged as criminal. German aircraft production did not increase as steeply as Allied and Soviet production during the critical years of 1942 and 1943. The Warfare History Network account notes that Germany failed to put its production on a war footing during this period, continuing to run factories for only 8 hours a day and failing to incorporate women into the workforce at the scale the Allies did. Some of these failures were structural problems beyond Milch's control. Some reflected strategic decisions made above his level. But Milch was the man in charge, and the consequences fell on the Luftwaffe's ability to compete in the air. What he did to compensate involved forced labor. As the war turned against Germany and the available German workforce shrank, Milch's production apparatus drew increasingly on concentration camp prisoners, prisoners of war, and forced laborers from across occupied Europe. This was not something that happened without his knowledge or direction. It was something he organized. During this same period, his relatives were being persecuted by the state he served. The logic of his position was absolute and without any comfortable resolution. He was a field marshal of the regime. His family members with Jewish ancestry were subject to the regime's racial laws. He could not protect them all, and in some cases, he could not protect them at all. By 1943 and into 1944, the Luftwaffe's performance was deteriorating. It had failed to win the Battle of Britain in 1940. It had failed to supply the encircled German army at Stalingrad by air in the winter of 1942 to 1943, a catastrophic failure that contributed to the loss of an entire German field army. Its ability to contest Allied air superiority over Germany was declining. Milch joined Joseph Goebbels and Heinrich Himmler in suggesting to Hitler that Göring should be replaced as commander of the Luftwaffe. Hitler refused. In June 1944, Göring forced Milch out of his position as director of air armament. His power within the Nazi state effectively ended there, though he retained his rank. He was captured by British forces at the end of the war. The circumstances of his capture were documented and somewhat extraordinary. When he surrendered his field marshal's baton to Commando Brigadier Derek Mills Roberts, who had personally witnessed the Bergen-Belsen concentration camp shortly before, broke the baton over Milch's head. Milch was then taken to a holding camp near the headquarters of British Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery. His trial came at Nuremberg in 1947 in what is known as the Milch Trial, one of the subsequent Nuremberg trials conducted by United States military tribunals after the main International Military Tribunal had concluded. The Harvard Law School Nuremberg documentation identifies the trial as running from January 2nd to April 17, 1947. Milch was convicted of war crimes and crimes against humanity, specifically for his role in the use of forced labor in Luftwaffe production. He was sentenced to life imprisonment at Landsberg prison in Bavaria, the same prison where Hitler had been held after the failed Munich Putsch in 1923. His sentence was commuted to 15 years in 1951. He was released on June 28, 1954, having served 7 years. He died in Dusseldorf on January 25, 1972, 80 years old. The documentary record that Brian Mark Rigg assembled over years of archival research and interviews with nearly 500 veterans establishes that Milch was not unique in kind, only in degree. At least 21 generals, 7 admirals, and 1 field marshal of Jewish descent served in the Wehrmacht with Hitler's personal consent, according to Rigg's research as cited in the Warfare History Network account. Around 60,000 men classified as half-Jews under the Nuremberg laws served in the Wehrmacht during the war. Around 90,000 quarter Jews served as well. The total figure across all categories of partial Jewish ancestry is estimated at up to 150,000. Their motivations were not uniform. Some enlisted out of genuine German patriotism and family military tradition. Some served because refusing would have endangered their families. Some, like Milch, were careerists who had committed to the Nazi project before the full implications of what that project meant became clear, and who then found it impossible to extract themselves. Some had no idea their ancestry was Jewish until the racial laws forced the question into the open. What Milch represents specifically is the apex of this phenomenon. He was not a reluctant draftee caught in an impossible situation. He was a willing architect of the regime's military power, a Nazi Party member since 1929, a man who helped design and build the weapon that the regime used to conquer Europe. The fact that his father was Jewish, that he held his position through a fraudulent affidavit his mother signed to protect her children, that his very presence in the Luftwaffe was itself an illegal absurdity under the laws of the state he served, none of that changed his choices or his actions. The Luftwaffe he helped build flew over the ghettos. It protected the supply lines. It provided air cover for the campaigns that created the conditions in which the Holocaust took place. A Jewish man's organizational genius and administrative drive was a structural component of the machine that murdered Jewish people at industrial scale. That sentence is not an accusation layered on top of the history. It is the history. Quote, for, The next section stays inside the same country and the same war, but moves from the field marshal's office to the infantry. Where Milch was a powerful figure who navigated the Nazi system at the highest levels, Werner Goldberg was an ordinary young soldier who had no idea any of this was coming, and whose face ended up on Nazi recruitment posters telling Germany what a perfect Aryan soldier looked like. 6. Werner Goldberg, the half-Jewish soldier used as the Nazi ideal German soldier. Werner Goldberg was born on October 3, 1919 in Berlin. His father, whose first name historical sources do not consistently record in full, had grown up in Königsberg as a member of the Jewish community. He had made a decision common among assimilated Jews in early 20th century Germany. He converted to Christianity, specifically to Lutheranism, was baptized in the local Lutheran church, and married a Christian woman. He wanted to be German first. He wanted his children to grow up as Germans, without the social barriers and quiet exclusions that came with being visibly Jewish in a society where that still mattered even before the Nazis arrived. Werner and his brother Martin, born in 1920, were both baptized in the Grunewald Lutheran Church at their father's request. They grew up Christian. They went to German schools. They lived in a German neighborhood in Berlin and thought of themselves as German. Werner had no idea his father had Jewish origins until the day that information was suddenly used against him at school. He was around 15 when it happened. The Nazi racial laws were tightening. The law for the restoration of the professional civil service, passed in April 1933, had already cost his father his position in the German civil service, stripping him of a job he had held as a German citizen. Then, in 1935, the Nuremberg laws were announced, classifying persons with at least 3 Jewish grandparents as fully Jewish, and establishing a category called Mischling for those with 1 or 2 Jewish grandparents. Werner's father had Jewish origins and had converted. Under Nazi racial logic, conversion did not change blood. Werner's father was Jewish by race, regardless of his Lutheran baptism, and that made Werner a Mischling of the first degree, a half-Jew, regardless of the fact that he had been raised entirely Christian and had never practiced Judaism in his life. He left his school in 1935 when it was declared Jew-free. He became an apprentice at a clothing company called Schneller und Schmeider, jointly owned by a Jew and a non-Jew, where many of his colleagues were Jews or other Mischlinge. His maternal uncle joined the Nazi Party during this period and refused to be seen with the Goldberg family, including Werner's own mother, the man's sister. The family was fracturing along the lines the Nazi state was drawing through it. In early 1938, Werner served a 6-month term in the Reich Labor Service, a compulsory work program for young German men. His uniform had a swastika on the armband. He wore it. He did what was required of him. On December 1st, 1938, Werner Goldberg joined the German army. He was 19 years old. He was tall, blonde, and blue-eyed, the physical type that Nazi propaganda had spent years presenting as the ideal of German racial identity. He was also, under the laws of the state whose uniform he was now wearing, a half-Jew. Both things were simultaneously true, and for a while, neither the army photographer nor the newspaper editors who would make use of the resulting photograph seemed to know or care about the second one. Germany invaded Poland on September 1st, 1939. Werner fought in that campaign. He served alongside childhood friends, including one named Karl Wolff, whose father had by then become a high-ranking SS officer. The invasion of Poland was over in weeks. The German military administration of occupied Poland began immediately afterward, and with it the systematic persecution of Polish Jews that would eventually escalate into the machinery of the Holocaust. Werner was in the army during all of this. He was a serving German soldier, while the regime whose uniform he wore was beginning the process of murdering people who shared his ancestry. Shortly after the beginning of the war, an army photographer took a photograph of Werner Goldberg in uniform. He looked exactly like what Nazi propaganda said a German soldier should look like. The photograph was sold by the official army photographer to a newspaper. The Sunday edition of the Berliner Tagesblatt ran it with a caption that read, Der ideale deutsche Soldat, the ideal German soldier. The photograph was then used on Wehrmacht recruitment posters. A half-Jewish man's face, printed and distributed across Germany, telling young German men what they should aspire to look like when they served their country. The Grokopedia article on Goldberg, drawing on Brian Mark Riggs' documented research, notes that his promotion to sergeant within months of enlisting further demonstrated how apparent Aryan physical characteristics enabled service and advancement, because the regime relied on superficial visual assessment rather than consistent application of ancestry-based standards. The army did not know, or did not check, or chose not to look. Werner continued serving. He participated in the early stages of the campaign in France in 1940. Then, on April 8, 1940, Hitler issued an order. All first-degree Mischlinge, men with 2 Jewish grandparents, were to be discharged from the Wehrmacht. The armistice with France came in June 1940. After it, the order was implemented. Werner Goldberg was expelled from the army. He returned to his former workplace, which had by then been renamed the Theodor Schmeider Company, having been required under Nazi commercial law to remove the Jewish name Schneller from its title. Werner worked there, obtained contracts for uniforms from the Army and the Navy, and attended the Reich Board of Labor Studies School, where he was one of 4 out of 80 students who passed the qualification to become a RIFA teacher, a certified industrial efficiency instructor. His father's situation was deteriorating. As the war continued and the Nazi persecution of Jews intensified through 1941 and 1942, Jewish people in Germany faced increasingly severe restrictions, forced relocation, and deportation. Werner's father, despite having converted to Christianity decades earlier, was classified as Jewish under the racial laws and was subject to all of it. In December 1942, his father was admitted to hospital. The Gestapo raided the hospital and transferred him to a Jewish hospital that had been requisitioned as a holding facility, a place from which Jewish people were being taken and sent to Auschwitz. Werner, who knew what was happening to people sent from that facility, gambled on Christmas Eve. He calculated that the guards would be drunk or absent during the holiday. He went to the hospital and took his father out. The Wikipedia article on Werner Goldberg documents what followed. His father was soon back in the hands of the Gestapo. In April 1943, he was summoned for deportation. Werner told him not to show up for the summons. He did not. The elder Goldberg was saved again. This was the same period when one of the most remarkable acts of resistance during the entire Nazi era was taking place in Berlin. In February and March 1943, the Nazi authorities began rounding up the last significant group of Jewish men still living in Berlin, most of whom were in mixed marriages with non-Jewish German women. They were taken to a building on the Rosenstrasse, a street in the center of the city. Over the following days, several hundred non-Jewish German women, and some family members and friends, including people like Werner, gathered outside the building and refused to leave. They stood in the street and demanded the release of the men held inside. The protest is documented by historian Nathan Stoltzfus in his book on the Rosenstrasse protest and referenced in Brian Mark Riggs' accounts of Goldberg's life. The women reportedly shouted, "Gebt uns unsere Männer zurück," "Give us our men back." The Gestapo threatened them. They came back the next day. The Nazis, who had spent a decade crushing any form of organized opposition with overwhelming force, found themselves facing something they had not prepared for. German women standing in the street in the capital city, publicly demanding their husbands back. Killing them or mass arresting them would have been a visible atrocity in the heart of Berlin at a moment when the regime needed civilian morale to hold. The men on the Rosenstrasse were released. It was, as Riggs' account notes, the most successful public protest during the Nazi years. Werner Goldberg participated in it. The half-Jewish man whose face had appeared on Nazi recruitment posters stood in a Berlin street with German women to protest the deportation of Jewish men. His father and he were among the documented survivors of the war. They were the only members of their immediate family to make it through. After the war, Werner Goldberg's life took a direction that might seem unexpected given everything that had happened to him. He joined the Christian Democratic Union of Germany, one of the major political parties of the new West German state, and entered politics. He served for 20 years, from 1959 to 1979, as a member of the Abgeordnetenhaus of Berlin, the city parliament of West Berlin. He was a politician in the democratic German state that replaced the one that had used his face on its recruitment posters and expelled him from its army and tried to deport his father. He died in Berlin on 28 September 2004 at the age of 84. He was survived by his wife, Gertrude Goldberg, and 3 children. His story formed part of the 2006 documentary Hitler's Jewish Soldiers, produced by Larry Price in association with the Israel Broadcasting Authority, which was inspired by Brian Mark Riggs' 2002 book. He also featured in the Yesterday television series Nazi Collaborators in December 2010, in an episode titled The Jews Who Fought for Hitler. His Wikipedia entry notes a final irony that occurred in 2015, 11 years after his death, when his photograph was used for a monument to protectors of motherland in Tobolsk, Russia, as a surrogate image for a Red Army soldier. The monument was fixed after the mistake was identified. The photograph had traveled. A Jewish German man's face, used first by the Nazis to represent ideal Aryan soldierhood, then accidentally used by post-Soviet Russia to represent the Soviet soldiers who defeated the Nazis. The same face, drafted twice for causes that had nothing to do with who he actually was. The Grokopedia account of Goldberg's case, drawn from Riggs' documented research, makes a point that is worth stating plainly. His selection as the ideal German soldier in 1939 was possible because the Nazi racial classification system relied on phenotypic traits, meaning how people looked, rather than consistent application of ancestry-based standards. The regime that built its entire ideology on the claim that race was a biological reality could not reliably identify Jewish people by looking at them. Werner Goldberg's existence was evidence against the central claim of the system that persecuted him. His father had tried to assimilate. He had converted to Christianity, changed his religious practice, married outside the community, raised his sons as Lutherans, and built a German life. None of it was sufficient. The racial laws reached back through conversion, through baptism, through decades of German civilian life, and classified him as something he had spent his adult life trying not to be defined by. And then they came for him, with the same Gestapo that came for everyone else. Werner spent the war in uniform for part of it, and out of uniform for the rest, in a country that could not decide what category to put him in, fighting in Poland for a regime that was simultaneously beginning the process of murdering his family's people, then expelled, then watching his father be seized and released, and seized again, then standing in a Berlin street demanding the release of Jewish men from a Gestapo holding facility. He came through it, voted, ran for office, served in parliament, and died in the city where his photograph had been printed as the ideal of something he was never allowed to be. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The next case in this series moves back across centuries to a man who did not serve the religion that persecuted him, but actively organized its destruction. Saul of Tarsus was not a reluctant participant or a man caught between systems. He was a zealot who sought out Christians, had them arrested, watched them die, and traveled between cities to make sure the movement could not survive. Then something happened on a road to Damascus that turned him into the person who would spread the faith he had been trying to destroy to most of the known world. 7. Saul of Tarsus, the Jewish official who hunted Christians, then became Christianity's greatest apostle. Saul was not a soldier in the way that most people use the word. He did not carry a sword into battle or command troops on a field. But he carried legal authority that had the same practical effect. He could walk into a house, drag people out of it, have them beaten, imprisoned, and killed. He did all of those things, deliberately and with genuine conviction that he was doing the right thing. By any functional definition, he was a combatant in a religious conflict, and the side he was fighting for was Judaism against the movement that would become Christianity. Then he switched sides completely, and the movement he had been trying to destroy became, largely through his efforts, a world religion. To understand what Saul was doing and why, you need to understand the world he came from. He was born in Tarsus, a city in the region of Cilicia, in what is now southern Turkey. His family held Roman citizenship, which was not common among Jews of that period, and indicated either wealth, social position, or both. He was educated in Jerusalem under the Rabbi Gamaliel, who is described in Acts 22 as one of the most respected Pharisaic teachers of the time, the grandson of Hillel, whose interpretations of Mosaic law were considered authoritative across Jewish communities throughout the Roman world. Saul was a Pharisee, from the tribe of Benjamin, as he himself states in his letter to the Philippian church recorded in the New Testament. The Pharisees were one of the major religious and political factions in first century Judaism. They were distinguished by strict adherence to the written Torah and to oral traditions that interpreted and extended it. They took the law seriously in a way that went beyond ordinary observance. Saul was not merely a Pharisee. He describes himself in that same letter as having surpassed many of his contemporaries in his zeal for the traditions of his fathers. What this meant in practice was that when a movement emerged within Judaism claiming that a man named Jesus, who had been executed by the Romans as a criminal and was considered by Jewish authorities to have died under the curse of God according to the law recorded in Deuteronomy, was actually the long-awaited Messiah and had risen from the dead, Saul regarded this as not just wrong, but dangerous. It was, from his perspective, apostasy, a corruption of Judaism from within. The movement's followers were Jews who had accepted a blasphemous claim, and they were spreading that claim through synagogues and communities across the region. The scholar Arlen Hultgren, cited in the Watchtower Online Library's examination of this period, argues that Paul the persecutor would not have opposed Christianity because he saw it as a religion outside Judaism. He would have seen it as a movement still subject to Jewish authority, still operating within Jewish communities, and therefore something that Jewish leadership had both the right and the obligation to correct. The correction Saul applied was not gentle. He first appears in the New Testament record at the stoning of Stephen. Stephen was one of the first men appointed to assist the apostles in the early Jerusalem community, described in Acts as full of faith and the Holy Spirit. He was brought before the Sanhedrin, the Jewish ruling council, on charges of blasphemy. His defense speech, recorded in Acts 7, was a lengthy recounting of Jewish history that concluded with an accusation against the council itself. The council reacted with fury. They dragged him outside the city and stoned him to death. Acts 7:58 records that the witnesses who threw the first stones laid their outer garments at the feet of a young man named Saul. Acts 8:1 states plainly that Saul was consenting to his death. The Greek word used in the original text for consenting, sunudokeo, carries the meaning of approving, being pleased with. The Bible Study Tool's account of this passage notes that Saul was not a reluctant bystander who went along with something he privately opposed. He approved. He was glad. What followed the death of Stephen was a wave of persecution against the Christian community in Jerusalem that Acts 8:3 describes in straightforward terms. Saul made havoc of the church, entering every house and dragging off men and women, committing them to prison. The phrase "made havoc" translates a Greek word, lumainominos, that was used in other ancient texts to describe the destruction of a city or the mauling of a body by a wild animal. The choice of that word was not accidental. The author of Acts was describing systematic, destructive violence, not selective enforcement. The persecution worked to a degree. Acts 8:1 records that all except the apostles were scattered throughout the regions of Judea and Samaria. The Jerusalem Christian community dispersed under pressure. But scattering a movement does not kill it, it spreads it. The people who fled Jerusalem took their message with them to new cities and communities, which meant the movement Saul was trying to contain was actually expanding under his pressure. Saul's response was to extend his reach. Acts 9:1 describes him as still breathing threats and murder against the disciples of the Lord. He went to the high priest and asked for letters authorizing him to travel to Damascus and bring back to Jerusalem, bound, any followers of the Way he found there. The Way was an early name for the Christian movement. The letters gave him legal authority under Jewish institutional structures to operate across jurisdictional lines. This was not a spontaneous act of individual violence. It was organized, authorized, cross-border enforcement of religious conformity. He set out for Damascus with companions. Damascus was a significant city, a major commercial hub with a substantial Jewish population and established synagogues. The journey from Jerusalem to Damascus was roughly 140 miles, a trip of several days on foot or by animal. He did not arrive as planned. Acts 9 records what happened outside Damascus. A light from heaven flashed around him. He fell to the ground. A voice spoke to him, asking why Saul was persecuting him. When Saul asked who was speaking, the voice said it was Jesus, the one Saul was persecuting. The instruction that followed was simple. Get up and go into the city, and you will be told what to do. The men traveling with Saul stood speechless. Acts 9:7 records that they heard the sound but did not see anyone. Saul got up from the ground and found he could not see. He was blind. His companions led him by the hand into Damascus. He spent 3 days there without sight, eating or drinking nothing. In Damascus, a Christian named Ananias received a vision, instructing him to find Saul at a house on a street called Straight and restore his sight. Ananias was understandably reluctant. Acts 9 records his response. He told the Lord that he had heard from many people about this man and the harm he had done to the saints in Jerusalem, and that he had authority from the chief priests to arrest all who called on the name of Jesus. He was being asked to walk voluntarily into the presence of the man who had been hunting people like him. He went anyway. He placed his hands on Saul and addressed him as Brother Saul. He told him that Jesus, who had appeared to him on the road, had sent him so that Saul might see again and be filled with the Holy Spirit. Acts 9:18 records that something like scales fell from Saul's eyes and he could see. He got up, was baptized, and ate. The conversion of Paul the Apostle. Wikipedia entry notes that this account appears 3 times in Acts, in chapters 9, 22, and 26, with slight variations between the accounts in details like whether Saul's companions saw the light or only heard the sound. Scholars have debated these variations for centuries. What is consistent across all 3 accounts is the core sequence. A man who was traveling to Damascus with legal authority to arrest Christians encountered something on the road that stopped him completely, left him blind for 3 days, and produced a total reversal of his direction. He did not return to Jerusalem as an enforcer. He stayed in Damascus and immediately began going into the synagogues and declaring that Jesus was the Son of God. Acts 9:21 records the reaction of those who heard him. They were astonished and kept asking, "Is this not the man who raised havoc in Jerusalem among those who call on this name? And had not he come here to take them as prisoners to the chief priests?" The answer to both questions was yes. Saul's past did not disappear because he changed sides. The people he had persecuted knew who he was. The movement he now joined knew who he was. Acts 9:26 records that when he tried to join the disciples in Jerusalem, after spending time in Damascus, they were all afraid of him. They did not believe he was really a disciple. A man named Barnabas vouched for him, explaining what had happened on the road to Damascus, and how Saul had preached in Damascus in the name of Jesus. Without that vouching, it is not clear the Jerusalem community would have accepted him at all. His own letters, which form a substantial portion of the New Testament, and which scholars across traditions treat as authentic primary sources from the 1st century, return repeatedly to the fact of his persecution of the church. He wrote to the Corinthian church, in the letter recorded as 1 Corinthians 15:9 that he was the least of the apostles, not fit to be called an apostle, because he had persecuted the church of God. He wrote to the Galatians that he had persecuted the church of God violently and tried to destroy it. He wrote to Timothy in the letter recorded as 1 Timothy 1:13, describing himself as a former blasphemer, persecutor, and insolent man who had received mercy because he had acted in ignorance and unbelief. He did not attempt to minimize what he had done before his conversion. He named it plainly and repeatedly, which is part of why the historical record of his persecution is as clear as it is. His own testimony is the primary source. What he did after the conversion occupied the rest of his life. He traveled across the Roman world from the Middle East through Asia Minor, into Greece, and eventually to Rome. He founded churches in cities that had never had Christian communities. He wrote letters to those communities that became the foundational documents of Christian theology, addressing questions about the nature of faith, the relationship between Jewish law and the new movement, the resurrection, and the behavior expected of people who identified as followers of Jesus. His letter to the Romans is still studied as one of the most theologically dense documents in Western religious history. He was imprisoned multiple times, he was beaten, he was shipwrecked. Acts 27 records one of those shipwrecks in enough navigational detail that scholars have used it to trace probable routes through the Mediterranean. He describes his own experiences in 2 Corinthians 11:24-26. 5 times he received the 39 lashes from Jewish authorities. 3 times he was beaten with rods. Once he was stoned and left for dead. 3 times he was shipwrecked. He was in danger from rivers, from bandits, from his own people, from Gentiles, in cities, in the wilderness, at sea. He was executed in Rome under the Emperor Nero, around 64 to 68 CE. The exact year is not established with certainty in the historical record. He was beheaded, which was the method of execution for Roman citizens, as distinct from crucifixion, which was used for non-citizens. His Roman citizenship, the same citizenship his family had held in Tarsus, entitled him to that specific end. The arithmetic of his life after Damascus is what makes his story sit where it does in the history of religion. The movement he had been trying to destroy when he left Jerusalem for Damascus had perhaps a few thousand followers, concentrated in Jerusalem and its surroundings. By the time he died, Christian communities existed in Jerusalem, Antioch, Damascus, Galatia, Ephesus, Corinth, Thessalonica, Colossae, Philippi, and Rome. He had not built all of them, but he had built many of them. And the theological framework he had articulated in his letters had given the movement intellectual coherence it could carry into every new environment it entered. The man who had dragged men and women out of their houses and sent them to prison for following Jesus spent the second half of his life being dragged into prisons himself for the same reason. He had been on both ends of the same persecution. He understood the machinery from the inside because he had operated it. That understanding, the knowledge of exactly how Jewish institutional authority worked, how arguments within Jewish communities could be prosecuted, what texts needed to be addressed and how, was part of what made him so effective as an advocate for the movement he had formerly fought. He knew the opposition's case better than almost anyone because he had made it himself, with full conviction, until the road to Damascus stopped him. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The next case in this series is the only one that does not center on a single person, but on an entire army. The soldiers of the Fourth Crusade set out as Christian warriors sworn to fight for their faith, excommunicated by their own pope before the campaign was over, and ended up delivering the most devastating single blow to Christian civilization in the medieval world, against a Christian city, in a war nobody had planned to fight. 8. The Crusaders of the Fourth Crusade, Christian soldiers who sacked the greatest Christian city on earth. In 1198, Pope Innocent III became pope at the age of 37, and almost immediately began organizing a new crusade. Jerusalem had been in Muslim hands since 1187, when Saladin's forces defeated the Crusader army at the Battle of Hattin and took the city. The Third Crusade, led by Richard I of England, Philip II of France, and the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick Barbarossa, had fought hard between 1189 and 1192, but had not retaken Jerusalem. It secured a truce that allowed Christian pilgrims access to the city, but left Muslim political control intact. Innocent III wanted to fix that. He wanted Jerusalem back. What he got instead was the destruction of the greatest Christian city in the world, carried out by the Christian army he had assembled to recapture it. The Fourth Crusade is one of the most thoroughly documented military disasters in medieval history, recorded by participants on both sides, including the French knight Geoffrey de Villehardouin, who wrote a first-hand account of the entire campaign, and the Byzantine official Nikitas Choniates, who witnessed the sack of Constantinople and described it in detail that historians still draw on 8 centuries later. The plan that Innocent III and the French barons who answered his call developed was strategically sensible. Rather than marching overland through hostile territory to reach the Holy Land, the crusade would travel by sea. The army would land in Egypt, defeat the Ayyubid Sultanate that controlled both Egypt and Jerusalem, and then push north. Egypt was the military and economic engine of Muslim power in the region. Knock it out first, and Jerusalem would follow. To travel by sea, they needed ships. The only power in the Mediterranean capable of providing them at the necessary scale was Venice. In 1201, the Crusader leaders sent 6 envoys to Venice to negotiate a contract. The envoys met with the Doge of Venice, Enrico Dandolo, who was around 90 years old and blind. What followed was one of the most consequential business negotiations in medieval history. Dandolo agreed to build a fleet capable of transporting 33,500 men with horses, supplies, and equipment for a fee of 85,000 marks of silver. Venice would also contribute 50 war galleys of its own at no extra charge, in exchange for half of all conquests made during the campaign. The contract was signed in April 1201. The problem emerged the following year when the crusading army assembled at Venice for departure. The leaders had massively overestimated how many men would actually show up. Many crusaders had made their own way to the Holy Land through other ports, or had simply not come at all. The army that gathered at Venice was around 12,000 men, not 33,000. The fee they could collectively pay was around 50,000 marks, not 85,000. They were 35,000 marks short of what they owed Venice for ships they had already contracted. Venice had built the fleet. The city had diverted its commercial and industrial resources toward this construction for a year. It was not willing to absorb the loss. Dandolo proposed an arrangement. If the Crusaders helped Venice recapture the city of Zara on the Dalmatian coast, which had recently come under Hungarian control and which Venice wanted back, Venice would defer the outstanding debt and allow the crusade to proceed. There was a direct and serious problem with this proposal. Zara was a Christian city. The King of Hungary, Emmerich, had himself taken the Crusaders' cross, meaning his lands were under the formal protection of the Church. Attacking a Crusader's lands was explicitly prohibited. Many of the Crusaders were deeply uncomfortable with what was being asked of them. The World History Encyclopedia article on the sack of Constantinople notes that debate raged in the army about the choices available. Some Crusaders refused and left. Others decided the practical necessity of keeping the fleet together outweighed the moral objection. Pope Innocent III found out what was being planned. He sent a letter to the Crusade's leaders, explicitly forbidding them from attacking Zara. The leaders hid the letter from the rank-and-file soldiers. In November 1202, the crusading army, under contract to fight Muslims in Egypt for the Christian recovery of Jerusalem, attacked Zara. The city's inhabitants lowered banners with crosses over the walls, trying to remind the attackers that they were all Christians. It did not work. Zara fell. Venice took it. When Innocent III received confirmation of what had happened, he excommunicated the entire crusading army. A force sworn to fight for Christianity had attacked a Christian city and been formally expelled from the church by the Pope who had sent them. The ban was later lifted for the Crusaders, though not for the Venetians, on the practical grounds that excommunicated Crusaders could not crusade. But the moral and institutional damage had been done. The army wintered in Zara. During that winter, envoys arrived from a Byzantine prince named Alexios Angelos, with an offer that would redirect the entire campaign. Alexios' father, Isaac II, had been emperor of Byzantium until 1195, when he was deposed, blinded, and imprisoned by his own brother, who took the throne as Alexios III. The younger Alexios had escaped and was looking for military help to restore his father. His offer to the Crusaders was specific and generous. If they helped him retake Constantinople and restore Isaac II as emperor, he would pay them 200,000 marks of silver, enough to cover their debt to Venice and fund the Egyptian campaign with money to spare. He would also provide 10,000 Byzantine troops to support the crusade, and he would bring the Eastern Orthodox Church under the authority of Rome, ending the schism between the Eastern and Western branches of Christianity that had formerly existed since 1054. It was a remarkable package of promises. Whether Alexios actually had the ability to deliver any of them, especially the reunion of the churches, was a question that not enough people in the Crusader leadership asked seriously enough. Innocent III wrote again, warning the Crusaders against going to Constantinople. The Catholic Answers account of the Fourth Crusade notes that he explicitly told them not to divert. They discussed it, argued, and the majority agreed to accept Alexios' offer. A significant number refused and made their own way to the Holy Land instead. The French nobleman, Simon de Montfort, documented in the Wikipedia article on the Fourth Crusade as an outspoken critic of the diversion, left the crusade rather than participate and traveled to Acre. Others followed him. Those who remained sailed for Constantinople. In June 1203, the main Crusader force reached the city. Constantinople was the largest, wealthiest, and most architecturally extraordinary urban center in the Christian world. Its population numbered in the hundreds of thousands. Its walls had repelled attackers for 9 centuries. The Theodosian walls on the landward side were triple-layered, nearly 12 meters high, and backed by towers every 50 meters. No army had ever successfully breached them from outside. The Crusaders attacked the sea walls in July 1203 and managed to force their way to a position that threatened the city enough to cause the reigning emperor, Alexios III, to flee in the night with the imperial treasury. The imprisoned Isaac II was released from his dungeon and restored to the throne. His son Alexios was crowned co-emperor as Alexios IV on August 1, 1203. Now came the problem that should have been anticipated. Alexios IV had made promises he could not keep. The 200,000 marks were not in the treasury because Alexios III had taken most of it when he fled. The Byzantine Church had no interest in submitting to Rome, and its clergy said so plainly. The population of Constantinople was not pleased about being put under the authority of foreign crusaders, who were now camped outside their walls, demanding payment for a debt their new emperor had incurred without consulting them. Anti-Latin riots broke out in the city in August 1203 and lasted through the autumn. In January 1204, a popular uprising deposed Alexios IV. A court official named Alexios Doukas took power and had Alexios IV strangled on February 8, 1204. The new emperor, Alexios V, told the Crusaders their debt was cancelled because the man who owed it was dead, and ordered them to leave Byzantine territory. The Crusaders refused. They were owed money they did not have and could not raise elsewhere. Without it, they could not pay Venice. Without the fleet, they had no way to reach Egypt or anywhere else. The campaign had been stalled outside Constantinople for months. Some of the leadership had concluded that the only practical path forward was to take Constantinople by force, collect what was owed from its treasury, and use the resources of the Byzantine state to fund the rest of the crusade. In March 1204, the Crusader and Venetian leadership formally decided on the outright conquest of Constantinople. They drew up an agreement dividing the Byzantine Empire between themselves in advance of taking it. 3/8 would go to Venice. The rest would be distributed among the Crusader nobles. A new emperor would be elected from among the Crusaders. The Byzantine imperial title, which traced its lineage back to ancient Rome, would become a Latin prize. On April 9, 1204, the first assault on the city began. It was repelled. On April 12th, the weather conditions shifted in the Crusaders' favor. A strong north wind pushed the Venetian ships close enough to the sea walls that attackers could reach the towers. After fierce fighting, approximately 70 Crusaders managed to get inside the city. More followed. By nightfall, the Crusaders held a section of the wall. The defenders' resistance collapsed faster than expected, partly because Alexios V fled before the fighting was over. The Wikipedia article on the sack of Constantinople documents what followed. Citizens were killed, women were raped, buildings were set on fire, churches were stripped of their contents. Niketas Koniates, who was inside Constantinople and escaped by disguising himself as a foreigner, wrote a detailed eyewitness account of the looting that historians have drawn on ever since. He described Crusaders drinking from altar vessels, prostitutes sitting on the Patriarch's throne in the Hagia Sophia, mules being led into churches to carry out looted goods, and the systematic destruction of statues, artworks, and manuscripts that had been preserved for centuries. The 4 bronze horses that had stood at the entrance to the Hippodrome of Constantinople were taken to Venice, where they were placed on the facade of St. Mark's Basilica. They remained there for centuries. Relics from Constantinople's churches ended up distributed across Western Europe. The golden reliquary, containing a fragment of what was believed to be the true cross, went to the Cathedral of Limburg in Germany, where it still is. 3 days of looting left Constantinople devastated. The city that had been the capital of the Byzantine Empire for 9 centuries, that had served as the primary repository of Roman and Greek classical knowledge, that had kept that knowledge alive during centuries when it had been largely lost in Western Europe, was stripped and burned by an army that had set out to fight Muslims. The historian J.J. Norwich wrote that by the sack of Constantinople, Western civilization suffered a loss greater than the burning of the Library of Alexandria in the 4th century, or the sack of Rome in the 5th, calling it perhaps the most catastrophic single loss in all history. Sir Stephen Runciman, one of the most respected medievalists of the 20th century, wrote in 1954 that there was never a greater crime against humanity than the Fourth Crusade. Pope Innocent III, when he received word of what had happened, was furious. The National Geographic account of the Fourth Crusade notes that the Crusaders had accepted the surrender of the city and then sacked it anyway. Innocent wrote letters condemning the violence, acknowledging that the Crusaders had attacked fellow Christians, and expressing horror at what had been done in the name of a religious campaign he had organized. His anger was genuine. It was also irrelevant. The damage was done. A Latin empire of Constantinople was established. Baldwin IX of Flanders was crowned emperor in the Hagia Sophia. The Byzantine Empire was partitioned among the Crusaders and Venice. Byzantine resistance organized in unconquered sections of the former empire, primarily in Nicaea, and eventually retook Constantinople in 1261. But the empire that recovered the city was a shadow of what had existed before 1204. Its economic base had been gutted. Its treasury had been looted. Its population had been traumatized. The Byzantine historian Choniates saw clearly what the long-term consequences would be. A weakened Byzantium could not hold the line against the Ottoman Turks, who would press in from the east over the following 2 centuries. The fall of Constantinople to the Ottomans came in 1453. 249 years after the Crusaders broke through the walls, Mehmed II's forces did the same thing. The city that Christian armies had sacked in 1204 fell to Muslim forces in 1453, and remained the Ottoman capital for nearly 5 centuries afterward. The World History Encyclopedia account notes that the sack weakened the Byzantine Empire in ways that allowed the Sultanate of Rum and later the Ottoman Turks to gain influence. The connection between 1204 and 1453 is not speculation. It is documented cause and effect. In 2001, Pope John Paul II wrote to Christodoulos, Archbishop of Athens, acknowledging what had happened. He wrote that it was tragic that the assailants, who set out to secure free access for Christians to the Holy Land, turned against their brothers in the faith, and that the fact that they were Latin Christians filled Catholics with deep regret. In 2004, during a visit by Bartholomew I, Patriarch of Constantinople, to the Vatican, John Paul II asked how they could not share, at a distance of 8 centuries, the pain and disgust. The Catholic Church formally expressed sorrow for what the Fourth Crusade did 800 years after it did it. The soldiers who followed Enrico Dandolo's fleet to Constantinople had not set out to sack a Christian city. Most of them had taken the cross in good faith, believing they were going to fight for Jerusalem. The sequence of debt, diversion, political manipulation, and broken promises that put them outside Constantinople's walls in April 1204 was not what any of them had signed up for. But they were there. They made choices at every step. They attacked Zara when they could have refused. They diverted to Constantinople when many of their companions did not. They agreed to the conquest when negotiation had failed. And then they looted for 3 days. Quote 7. The next case is a soldier whose situation was, in some ways, the mirror image of what the Fourth Crusade represents. Where the Crusaders ended up fighting against their own religion through a chain of external pressures and failed negotiations, the man in Section 9 made a clean, deliberate choice to serve a foreign religious tradition and then dedicated his entire military career to it, rising to the highest possible rank while fighting the very Protestant world he had been born into. 9. Maurice de Saxe, the Protestant-born marshal who led Catholic France against the Protestant world. Hermann Maurice, Count of Saxony, was born on October 28, 1696 in Goslar, in the Duchy of Brunswick-Wolfenbüttel in the Holy Roman Empire. He was illegitimate. His father was Augustus II the Strong, Elector of Saxony and King of Poland, one of the most powerful rulers in Northern Europe. His mother was Maria Aurora von Königsmark, a Swedish countess whose brother had disappeared under suspicious circumstances at the Prussian court years before Maurice was born. Augustus acknowledged his son, gave him his name and a title, and arranged for his education. What Augustus did not give him was legitimacy in the formal legal sense, which meant Maurice could not inherit the electorate of Saxony or the Polish throne. He would have to make his own way. Augustus II himself had converted from Lutheranism to Catholicism in 1697, not out of religious conviction, but because Polish law required the King of Poland to be Catholic. Saxony remained Lutheran. The conversion was purely political. It was the kind of transaction that defined how religion and power intersected in early 18th century Europe, where confessional identity was often less about personal belief and more about which institutional arrangements a ruler needed to maintain. Maurice grew up in this environment. His father was a converted Catholic king of a Lutheran electorate. His mother was Lutheran. He was raised in a world where religion was a category of political negotiation as much as personal faith. He was baptized and raised Lutheran, which was the dominant confession of his father's German territories, and of the social world Maurice moved through as a young man. He entered military service at the age of 12, joining the army during the War of the Spanish Succession. He fought at the Siege of Lille in 1708, where he was 12 years old and in an active combat zone. He fought at the Battle of Malplaquet in 1709, one of the bloodiest engagements of the early 18th century, where the Allied forces of Britain, the Dutch Republic, and the Holy Roman Empire under the Duke of Marlborough and Prince Eugene of Savoy defeated the French army at a cost of around 20,000 Allied casualties and 12,000 French. Maurice survived it. He was 13 years old. He continued fighting through his teenage years, acquiring practical military experience at a pace and intensity that had no equivalent in formal education. By the time he was in his 20s, he had fought in multiple campaigns across different theaters, served under several commanders, and developed the tactical instincts that come only from being present when things go wrong and having to adapt in real time. His ambitions ran beyond military service. In 1726, he attempted to become Duke of Courland, a small duchy on the Baltic coast that is now part of Latvia and Lithuania. Courland was electing a new duke, and Maurice put himself forward as a candidate. He was actually elected by the Courlander nobility in 1726, a remarkable achievement for an illegitimate German count with no territorial base of his own. But the election was not recognized by the powers surrounding Courland, particularly Russia under Catherine I, who had her own preferences for who should control the duchy. Maurice was forced out. His bid for an independent principality collapsed. He returned to France, where he had been building connections since the early 1720s. France was the dominant military power in continental Europe and the most prestigious place for an ambitious soldier to make a career. It was also Catholic. The French army operated under the authority of the French crown and the Catholic institutional framework that surrounded it. To hold senior command in the French military, an officer needed to be Catholic. Maurice converted. The conversion happened as a practical necessity of his French military career. The Britannica biography of Maurice de Saxe and the broader historical record of his life document him as a man for whom religion was never a matter of deep personal conviction in either direction. He was not fleeing Lutheranism because he had found it spiritually inadequate. He was not embracing Catholicism because he had been moved by its theology. He was converting because the French army required it of senior commanders, and he intended to be a senior commander. He was commissioned as a lieutenant general in the French army in 1720. He spent the following years continuing to study military theory and practice. He wrote a military treatise in 1732 called Mes Rêveries, composed over 13 nights while he was seriously ill and believed he might be dying. The work covered infantry tactics, cavalry deployment, discipline, the use of terrain, and broader questions of military organization and command. It circulated in manuscript form for years before being published posthumously in 1757. Military historians have studied it ever since as a significant document of 18th century military thought. Frederick the Great of Prussia later called Maurice the first captain of Europe, the highest possible assessment from a man not known for generous evaluations of his contemporaries. The war that gave Maurice his defining reputation began in 1740. The War of the Austrian Succession broke out when the Holy Roman Emperor Charles VI died without a male heir, leaving his daughter Maria Theresa to claim his titles. Several European powers, led by Prussia under Frederick II, and supported at various points by France, Bavaria, Spain, and Saxony, disputed her succession. Britain and the Dutch Republic supported Maria Theresa. France supported the opposition. Maurice was given command of French forces in the Austrian Netherlands, the region that is now Belgium. This placed him in command of Catholic French armies fighting against a coalition that included Protestant Britain and the Protestant Dutch Republic, among other powers. The man born Lutheran, converted to Catholicism as a career requirement, was now the operational commander of the Catholic French military effort against the Protestant world he had come from. His campaign in the Austrian Netherlands produced his most celebrated victory. On the 11th of May, 1745, French forces under Maurice met a combined army of British, Dutch, Hanoverian, and Austrian troops at Fontenoy, a village in what is now Belgium. The battle is one of the most extensively documented engagements of the 18th century. The Allied army was commanded by the Duke of Cumberland, the son of King George II of Britain. It numbered around 50,000 men. Maurice's French force was of comparable size. Maurice had prepared the ground carefully, positioning his forces in a way that channeled the Allied advance into killing zones covered by French artillery and infantry. When the main British infantry assault came, it punched through the French lines and advanced to within close range of the French command position before Maurice stabilized the situation with a carefully organized counterattack that drove the British column back. The Allied army retreated. French forces took the field. The victory at Fontenoy was celebrated across France. Louis XV was present on the battlefield. Maurice became the most famous military commander in Europe. Later that year, he was promoted to Marshal General of France, the highest military rank the kingdom could bestow, a title so senior that only 6 men had ever held it before him. He received the Château de Chambord, one of the great royal palaces of France, as a gift from Louis XV in recognition of his service. None of this changed what he was by background and birth. He was a German-born, illegitimate, originally Lutheran soldier who had converted to Catholicism to advance in the French military and had risen to its absolute pinnacle. The Protestant powers he was defeating at Fontenoy and in subsequent campaigns in the Austrian Netherlands included the British forces that were fighting under a Protestant monarchy, the Dutch forces from the Protestant Dutch Republic, and their Protestant German allies. The faith tradition Maurice had been born into, raised in, and formally belonged to until his conversion out of career necessity was on the other side of the battlefield. His personal life was not one that suggested deep engagement with either Catholicism or any other religion. He had numerous relationships with women throughout his life, including actresses and other figures outside the social circles where a man of his position might have been expected to confine his attention. He had several children by different women, none of them legitimate by the standards of the time. His health was poor for much of his later career. He had dropsy, a condition involving fluid accumulation that modern medicine would identify as a symptom of cardiac or other organ failure, and he was seriously ill during the later stages of the War of the Austrian Succession. He commanded at Fontenoy from a wicker litter because he was too sick to ride. He continued fighting through the mid-1740s, winning further engagements in the Austrian Netherlands. The War of the Austrian Succession ended with the Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle in 1748. Maurice remained in France, living at Chambord and continuing to work on military theory and practice. He died on November 30th, 1750, at the Château de Chambord, at the age of 54. The cause of death is recorded in historical sources as likely related to his ongoing health problems, with some accounts suggesting the immediate cause was a lung infection. Voltaire, who knew him, wrote about his death. Frederick the Great, learning of it, is recorded as having expressed genuine respect for his abilities. His funeral presented a religious complication. He had converted to Catholicism, but his conversion was widely understood to have been a formality rather than a sincere change of faith. The Catholic Church's position on burial rites for converts who had not practiced the faith consistently was not straightforward. He was buried in the garrison church of St. Thomas in Strasbourg. His tomb remains there, a significant 18th century sculptural monument depicting Maurice descending toward death while allegorical figures representing France, strength, and Hercules attempt to hold him back, with defeated enemies, including figures representing Britain and the Dutch Republic, crouched at his feet. The monument was created by the sculptor Jean-Baptiste Pigalle and took nearly 30 years to complete after Maurice's death. It is considered one of the masterpieces of 18th century French sculpture and one of the finest funerary monuments in Europe. It sits in a Protestant church, because Strasbourg's garrison church of St. Thomas was and remained Lutheran. A Catholic convert, celebrated by a Catholic monarchy, buried under a monument in a Lutheran church. The religious confusion of his life followed him into his monument. His military legacy is real and documented. The tactics he developed and described in May Reveries influenced French and European military thought through the end of the 18th century. His emphasis on discipline, tactical flexibility, and the intelligent use of terrain appeared in the work of later commanders and theorists. The specific context of his career, a foreign-born, illegitimate, Protestant converted to Catholic mercenary commander, rising to the highest military rank in the most powerful continental army in Europe, was a product of a particular moment in European history when confessional identity was both politically essential and, for men with sufficient ability and ambition, negotiable. What he demonstrates, placed alongside the other cases in this series, is that fighting against one's own religious tradition takes many forms. Khalid ibn al-Walid and Saul of Tarsus experienced genuine transformations. Maurice experienced a transaction. He did not fight against Lutheranism because he had come to believe it was wrong. He fought against Protestant armies because France was paying him and because he was very good at it. The faith he was born into became, through the logic of professional military service, the faith of his enemies. He appears not to have found this troubling in any documented way. __quote _8__. The final case in this series involves a man whose situation was in every respect more painful than Maurice's comfortable conversion. Where Maurice chose Catholicism and made a career from it, Helmuth Wilberg served a regime that classified him as racially subhuman while he was helping design the very military doctrine the regime used to conquer the continent, and the consequences of what he built outlasted him by years that changed everything. 10. Helmuth Wilberg, the half-Jewish general who helped invent Blitzkrieg for Hitler. Helmuth Wilberg was born on June 1, 1880 in Berlin. His father was Jewish. Under the racial laws that would define Germany half a century later, this made Wilberg a Mischling of the first degree, a half-Jew, a category that should have barred him from military service under the Nazi state entirely. Instead, he became a General der Flieger, a full general in the Luftwaffe, equivalent in rank to a full general in the army, and one of the most intellectually significant military minds in the German armed forces between the two world wars. The doctrine he helped develop killed more people than almost any other military innovation of the 20th century. His early life followed the pattern common to assimilated Jewish families in Wilhelmine Germany. His father had Jewish heritage, but the family was integrated into German society in the way that many German Jewish families were during the decades of relative tolerance that preceded the First World War. Wilberg identified as German. He pursued a military career because Germany was his country, and the military was a legitimate path for an ambitious young man with the right background and abilities. He entered the Imperial German Army and served as an infantry officer before transferring to aviation when military flying became a serious military discipline in the years just before the First World War. He was among the earliest generation of German military aviators. The Imperial German Air Service was established in 1910, and Wilberg was part of its development from the beginning. He flew observation missions and gained practical experience in how aircraft could be used in coordination with ground forces, which was the fundamental tactical question of early military aviation. How do you make the aircraft and the soldier on the ground work together rather than operate in parallel? When the First World War began in 1914, Wilberg served in the air service throughout the conflict. He rose to command positions and ended the war as one of the more experienced aviation commanders in the German military. He received decorations for his service, including the Iron Cross, establishing the military record that would later give him a degree of protection when Nazi racial laws threatened his career. The war ended in November 1918, with Germany's defeat. The Treaty of Versailles, signed in June 1919, imposed strict limitations on German military capacity. Germany was forbidden from having an air force entirely. Its army was capped at 100,000 men. The general staff system was prohibited. The terms were designed to prevent Germany from rebuilding the military machine that had fought the war. German officers who had made aviation their career found themselves in an institution that was legally prohibited from existing. What they did instead was think. The decade and a half between the Versailles restrictions and Hitler's open rearmament in 1935 was, for a certain group of German military officers, an extended period of theoretical development. They could not build the force they wanted to build. They could study, write, debate, and develop doctrine for the force they would build when the restrictions lifted. Wilberg was central to this process. The Warfare History Network account of the men of Jewish descent who served in the Wehrmacht, drawing on Brian Mark Riggs' documented research, identifies Wilberg as a brilliant strategist who helped develop the operational concept of blitzkrieg. The term blitzkrieg, meaning lightning war, was not actually used by German military planners themselves as a formal doctrinal term. It was a description applied by journalists and commentators to what German forces actually did in Poland in 1939 and France in 1940. But the tactical and operational ideas that produced those campaigns were developed during precisely the period when Wilberg was an active participant in German military thinking. The core concept was not complicated in its basic form, though executing it required enormous coordination. Instead of attacking along a broad front and trying to push the enemy back gradually, a concentrated armored force would punch through a weak point in the enemy line, drive deep into the rear to destroy command, communications, and supply, and create a situation where large enemy formations were cut off and surrounded before they could react. Infantry would follow to consolidate. Close air support, meaning aircraft attacking targets directly in front of advancing ground forces, would substitute for the heavy artillery that slow positional warfare had relied upon in the previous war. Speed was the mechanism. Disruption of the enemy's ability to respond was the goal. Developing this required thinking through how aircraft and tanks could communicate and coordinate in real time, how air commanders and ground commanders could share a common understanding of a rapidly moving situation, what kinds of targets air support should prioritize, and how the logistics chain could keep a fast-moving armored force supplied across the distances it needed to cover. These were not simple problems. Getting them wrong in the field would mean aircraft bombing their own troops, tanks outrunning their fuel, and infantry unable to follow through on armored breakthroughs. Wilberg worked on these problems. He was involved in the development of combined arms doctrine during the period of restricted German military activity after Versailles. His expertise in aviation coordination with ground forces, built on his First World War experience, made him one of the officers best positioned to think through how a future German military that was allowed to have aircraft again would use them. The rearmament came. When Hitler came to power in January 1933 and began the process of rebuilding the German military in open violation of Versailles, the Luftwaffe was formally established in 1935. Wilberg's problem was that his father was Jewish, and the Nazi racial laws that came into effect that same year classified him as a Mischling. He should have been excluded. He was not excluded. Hitler personally intervened. Brian Mark Riggs' documented research, cited in the Warfare History Network account and in the broader literature on Wehrmacht soldiers of Jewish descent, confirms that Hitler had the authority under the supplementary Nuremberg decrees to exempt individuals from racial classification by issuing what were called German blood declarations. He used this authority for a small number of officers whose military expertise or records he considered valuable enough to override the ideological requirements. Wilberg was among them. He received a German blood certificate and was permitted to continue serving. The reasons Hitler made these exceptions were not humanitarian, they were practical. Wilberg had knowledge, experience, and intellectual capability that the new Luftwaffe needed. Getting rid of him would have cost the German Air Force something it could not easily replace. The same calculation that led Göring to protect Erhard Milch applied to Wilberg, though at a different level of the command structure. Wilberg served in the Luftwaffe through the late 1930s, continuing to contribute to the development of air doctrine and operational planning. His most direct contribution to what would become the Blitzkrieg campaigns was in the coordination of air and ground operations, the specific problem he had been working on since the First World War. The Spanish Civil War provided the German military with its first opportunity to test the new doctrine in practice. Between 1936 and 1939, Germany sent the Condor Legion to support Francisco Franco's nationalist forces against the Spanish Republic. The Condor Legion operated aircraft, including the Bf-109 fighter and the Ju-87 Stuka dive bomber, in a combat environment that was less intense than a full European war, but real enough to generate genuine tactical lessons. German commanders and theorists drew on those lessons in refining their operational concepts. The Luftwaffe's use of the Stuka as a close air support weapon, diving on targets ahead of advancing ground forces, was developed and refined partly through the Spanish experience. The dive bomber, with its distinctive wailing sirens, was not merely a weapon. It was a psychological instrument designed to break the cohesion of defending forces before the tanks arrived. That integration of psychological and physical effect into a coordinated air-ground assault was exactly the kind of thing that doctrinal thinkers like Wilberg had been working toward. When Germany invaded Poland on September 1st, 1939, the campaign lasted 27 days before Polish resistance effectively collapsed. The speed was not the product of overwhelming numbers alone. German forces were not numerically dominant everywhere they fought. The speed came from the application of concentrated armored forces at selected points, supported by aircraft that attacked Polish airfields, command centers, and troop concentrations, all coordinated in a way that prevented Polish forces from responding coherently to breakthroughs before those breakthroughs became irreversible encirclements. France fell in 6 weeks in May and June 1940. The British Expeditionary Force was driven to the coast at Dunkirk and evacuated by sea. The French army, which had been considered one of the most formidable in Europe, collapsed faster than almost any observer outside Germany had believed possible. The operational concept that produced this outcome had been developed, among other places, in the theoretical work of officers like Wilberg during the years when Germany was forbidden from building the force that eventually executed it. Wilberg was still serving when the war began. He held the rank of General der Flieger and remained in active service through the first years of the conflict. His role was primarily in command and planning functions, rather than direct operational leadership of combat formations. He died on November 20th, 1941. His death came in a plane crash near Breslau, the city now known as Wrocław in Poland. He was 61 years old. The circumstances of the crash are recorded in the historical sources, without suggestion of anything other than an accident. He died as a serving German general. The timing of his death placed it in the middle of Operation Barbarossa, the German invasion of the Soviet Union that had begun on June 22, 1941. By November 1941, German forces had advanced deep into Soviet territory, reaching the outskirts of Moscow. The Einsatzgruppen, the mobile killing units that followed the German army into Soviet territory, had already murdered hundreds of thousands of Jewish people in the occupied Soviet Union. The Holocaust, as an organized program of systematic extermination, was in the process of being formalized. The Wannsee Conference, at which senior Nazi officials coordinated the logistics of the final solution, took place on January 20th, 1942, 2 months after Wilberg died. He did not live to see the full industrial implementation of the program designed to murder people with his ancestry, but the campaigns he had helped make possible were already creating the conditions for it. The conquest of Poland had put 3 million Polish Jews under German control. The conquest of France had put the Jews of Western Europe under threat. The invasion of the Soviet Union was accompanied from its first days by mass shootings of Jewish communities. The doctrine Wilberg had spent his career developing was the mechanism by which the German military had achieved those conquests. He had not designed it as a tool of genocide. He had designed it as a solution to tactical and operational military problems, drawing on his experience and his study of how modern weapons could be combined for maximum effect. The purposes to which it was subsequently put were not his stated intention. They were the consequence. This is what distinguishes Wilberg from most of the other cases in this series. Khalid ibn al-Walid changed sides and fought for the cause he had previously fought against. Maurice of Saxony betrayed the Protestant League and then reversed himself. Henry IV converted and governed as the head of the church his former allies were fighting. Radu the Handsome led Ottoman forces against his Christian brother. Saul of Tarsus hunted Christians and became Christianity's most effective advocate. The soldiers of the Fourth Crusade attacked a Christian city while on a Christian military expedition. Werner Goldberg served the army whose uniform he wore and was expelled when his ancestry was discovered. Erhard Milch built the Luftwaffe while classified as a half-Jew under the laws of the state he was serving. Wilberg's case adds a dimension none of the others quite reach. He was not present when the worst consequences of his work unfolded. He died before the full machinery of the Holocaust was formally organized. But the military capability he had helped develop had already done most of what it needed to do to make that machinery possible. A Jewish general's intellectual contribution to German military doctrine had helped create the conditions for the murder of Jewish people at a scale without precedent in human history. He has no prominent memorial. There is no monument comparable to Maurice de Sax's elaborate tomb in Strasbourg. His name does not appear in popular histories of the Second World War with anything like the frequency it appears in specialized military historical literature. Brian Mark Riggs' research brought him back into documented view after decades in which his role had been largely unexamined. What Riggs' work establishes, across the nearly 500 interviews he conducted and the archival research he carried out, is that Wilberg was not an anomaly in the way his individual story might suggest. He was one of a category. 21 generals, 7 admirals, and 1 field marshal of Jewish descent served in the Wehrmacht with Hitler's personal consent. Up to 150,000 men of partial Jewish ancestry served in total. Their situations varied enormously. Some were careerists who had committed to the German military before the Nazi regime existed and found themselves unable to extract themselves when it arrived. Some served to protect family members. Some had no idea of their ancestry until the racial laws forced disclosure. Some, like Milch, were willing participants in the Nazi project. Some, like Goldberg, were ordinary young men caught in a system they had not designed. Wilberg sits somewhere in this range. He was a professional officer who had built a career on genuine expertise. He served because that was what he had done his entire adult life, and because Hitler had personally exempted him from the laws that would otherwise have removed him. Whether he reflected on what his service meant, given his ancestry and the regime's stated intentions toward people with that ancestry, is not recorded in the surviving historical sources. What is recorded is the work, the doctrine, the campaigns, the speed with which Poland fell, and France fell, and the Soviet Union's western territories fell, the conquered territory that became the space in which the Holocaust was carried out. A half-Jewish general's professional contribution, stretched across decades of careful military thinking, sits inside all of that, whether anyone intended it to or not. That is where this series of 10 cases ends, not with a redemption, not with a clear moral, but with the most uncomfortable version of the question the whole series has been asking. What does it mean to fight against your own religion? Sometimes it means a genuine transformation, as it did for Khalid and for Saul. Sometimes it means a calculated betrayal that later reverses itself, as it did for Maurice of Saxony. Sometimes it means a political transaction, as it did for Henry IV and Maurice de Saxe. Sometimes it means a child handed to a sultan who grows up to fight his own brother. Sometimes it means a face on a poster. Sometimes it means a field marshal who signs documents while his relatives are being deported. And sometimes it means a general who dies in a plane crash in 1941, 2 months before the conference where the paperwork for the final solution is signed, never knowing exactly what his life's work had been used to make possible. If you enjoyed this breakdown, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.